Hello, my dear friends. They washed their babies in dirty water, rubbed their skin with animal fat, and slept on beds alive with fleas. The air itself was made of sweat, rot, and prayer. Cleanliness was rare enough to be feared, and filth was mistaken for virtue. In a world where perfume meant sin and odour meant honesty, survival had its own strange scent. Tonight, you'll walk through that world, where dirt was faith and decay was simply life continuing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to walk through a medieval village at dawn, one would likely find the same sight waiting at the edge of every settlement. A large pit, dark and silent, sat in the open, surrounded by worn paths of trampled grass. This was not a well or a pond, but the public toilet. Men, women, and children all used it, crouching side by side with no barrier, no modesty, and no thought of privacy. The pit was deep but rarely emptied, its surface a thick mixture of waste, insects, and rainwater. When the wind changed, the smell carried through the entire village, clinging to walls, clothes, and hair. The stench was so constant that people stopped noticing it. It became part of the air they breathed and the world they lived in. It is almost comical that a place filled with human waste could be considered a normal community feature. But in medieval life, it truly was. The pits were dug by hand, often by the poorest labourers, and maintained by no one. Once full, another hole was dug nearby, and the old one was left uncovered. Children played near them, chickens pecked around the edges, and stray dogs scavenged for scraps. In summer, the heat made everything worse. Clouds of flies hovered above the open surface, and every gust of air carried the heavy odour of decay. People covered their faces with cloth, yet still walked past without complaint. No one imagined a better way. The idea of a private toilet or running water belonged to no one's dreams. Cleanliness was not a concept tied to health. It was tied to appearance and faith. The church preached about the purity of the soul, not the body, and so the body was left to rot quietly in its habits. Even the wealthier villagers used similar pits, though theirs might be enclosed within wooden sheds or behind stone walls. These offered a bit of privacy but did nothing to stop the smell. Waste drained into nearby fields or rivers, sometimes into the same water people drank from. If compared to today, it would be like a neighbourhood where every street corner had an open dumpster of sewage, and yet no one thought it strange. That was the medieval norm. The connection between filth and disease was not understood. Illness came and went like bad weather, without reason or warning. When people fell sick, they prayed rather than cleaned. Rain turned the ground into sludge. Paths leading to the pits became slippery trails of mud mixed with excrement. In crowded towns, the situation was worse. Some pits overflowed and ran down the streets, soaking into shoes and hems of dresses. There were stories of people falling into the holes at night, never to be seen again. But those tales were told without outrage, only with grim amusement. The danger was accepted, just like hunger and plague. I always find it haunting how acceptance can turn horror into routine. Once a society stops expecting better, it stops seeing filth as something wrong. The location of these communal toilets reflected medieval priorities. They were usually placed downhill from houses, near rivers or fields used for farming. The waste mixed with the soil, feeding crops that would later be eaten. The circle of contamination was complete. Yet to those who lived within it, the system seemed practical. Waste was not waste if it disappeared into the earth. They called it returning to nature, though the nature they returned to was slowly poisoned. The smell of these pits became a clock for the day. In the morning, it mingled with smoke from cooking fires. By noon, it ripened in the heat, and by night, it clung low over the fields like a fog that would not lift. Travellers often judged a town by its scent before they even saw it. The richer the town, the farther its pits were from the main road. But in poorer places, the first greeting a visitor received was the sour, heavy air of an uncovered hole. Records describe foreign merchants complaining of the smell, but locals saw this as a weakness. To them, the stench was proof of life and work. A village without it would seem abandoned. The logic feels absurd now, yet it reveals how deeply discomfort was woven into survival. Women faced particular hardship. Going to the pit meant exposure to others' eyes, to danger, and to shame. Many went at night to avoid being seen, which only increased their risk of assault or accident. The act of relieving oneself was never private, only tolerated. No one questioned why this should be so. Privacy was a luxury reserved for prayer, not for bodily needs. Even monasteries and castles, which prided themselves on order, often had waste channels that emptied directly into moats or streams. Clean water and waste shared the same path, and disease spread with ease. The open pits also shaped how people thought about smell. A constant odour dulled the senses. Fragrance became meaningless when everything reeked of waste. Perfumes and herbs were used not for beauty but for defence, small shields against a world that stank. Housewives scattered rushes and flowers on floors, hoping to mask what lay beneath. It worked only for a while. The smell always won. By the end of the Middle Ages, a few towns began to experiment with covered latrines, but they were rare and costly. Most people continued to live beside their pits, digging new ones when the old ones filled, and teaching their children to do the same. Hygiene was not a word they knew, and if someone had spoken it, no one would have cared. What mattered was endurance. Life was about surviving the day, not improving it. Even now, imagining the scene feels unreal. The idea of hundreds of people using the same hole, day after day, surrounded by flies and decay, seems like something out of a nightmare. Yet for them, it was only another part of daily life. In that world, foulness did not shock, it simply existed, as ordinary as the sound of church bells or the smell of bread. The line between filth and normalcy had long disappeared, leaving only habit and necessity. The village pit was more than a toilet. It was a reflection of how people lived with dirt, and how they stopped seeing it as dirt at all. From that pit rose the air they breathed and the soil that fed them. Somewhere in that same air, new habits were forming, habits that would define their idea of cleanliness for centuries. What they learned next would not be cleaner, only stranger, and perhaps even more dangerous. The streets of medieval towns were alive with filth. Wastewater ran through open ditches that lined the roads, carrying everything from household refuse to human waste. These shallow channels were meant to drain the streets, but most of the time, they simply collected whatever was poured into them. Rain turned them into rivers of foul sludge that rose over the edges, washing across the feet of anyone passing by. In dry weather, the filth hardened into crusts of dirt that crumbled into dust with each step. The smell never left. It clung to the air like fog, thick and sour, drifting through windows and markets alike. It is almost absurd that people walked past these open gutters every day and still called their towns civilized. The ditches were not hidden. They ran openly beside houses and shops, cutting through the heart of daily life. When women scrubbed laundry, they dumped the grey water straight into the gutter. When men cleaned fish or butchered animals, blood and offal followed the same route. Every fluid from the home eventually met in the same grim stream. Dogs and pigs wandered freely, lapping from the ditches and spreading the filth farther. Chickens pecked at scraps floating in the water. No one stopped them. The idea that these channels might spread sickness was not yet known. To most people, disease came from bad luck or divine punishment, not from something as ordinary as the street under their feet. In larger towns, the problem grew worse. Streets were narrow, buildings crowded, and the flow of waste constant. The ditches filled quickly, unable to drain into the sluggish rivers beyond the walls. When the rains came, everything overflowed, human waste, animal remains, and mud mixed into one thick flood. People trudged through it, skirts and boots soaked in decay. Some tried to sweep the filth aside, but there was nowhere to move it. The street was both home and sewer. If compared to today, it would be like walking through a city where every sidewalk is a flowing gutter of garbage, and yet no one finds it unusual. In dry seasons, dust replaced the floods. The crusted remains of waste cracked underfoot and rose into the air. Each breath carried invisible particles of filth. Children played near the ditches, running and laughing as their toys splashed in the brown water. They dipped sticks into it, watching the ripples spread, unaware of the danger. For them, it was simply part of the world, as natural as rain or wind. Parents did not stop them because they, too, had grown up beside the same gutters. Familiarity made everything harmless in their eyes. Something is unsettling about how easily people learn to live with what should disgust them. At night, the stench grew stronger. Without the sun to dry the waste, the air thickened with the smell of rot. It seeped into clothing and bedding, into bread left uncovered on tables. The same hands that emptied chamber pots would later knead dough or pour ale. The sense of separation between clean and dirty barely existed. Even in wealthy homes, the drainage channels ran close to walls, and servants poured refuse into them every morning. Inside, candles and incense tried to mask the odour, but the illusion of cleanliness faded as soon as the door opened. Animals suffered too. Horses slipped on the slick stones, carts got stuck in the muck, and rats thrived in the mixture of food scraps and waste. The rats, in turn, carried fleas, and the fleas carried plague. Yet no one understood the chain of cause and effect. To them, the rats were just another part of the streetscape, as ordinary as the cobblestones beneath them. Clean water was precious, so no one wasted it on washing away filth. When rain did the work for them, people even welcomed it, grateful for the temporary relief from the smell. But once the sun returned, the same filth dried again, waiting for the next storm. Cities tried to manage the problem with primitive rules. Some towns ordered residents to clear the gutters outside their doors each week. Others imposed fines for dumping waste directly onto the street. But without real drains or covered pipes, these laws meant little. Waste had to go somewhere, and the streets remained the easiest option. Builders avoided installing underground channels because they feared demons or spirits hiding in dark tunnels. Superstition mixed with ignorance ensured progress stayed slow. Travellers from other lands often wrote about the filth with disbelief. They described roads that squelched underfoot and markets that smelled of both food and excrement. Visitors washed their boots after every trip, but locals laughed at them for the effort. To be bothered by dirt was considered delicate or foolish. The medieval mind saw the body as temporary and unworthy of much care. Cleanliness was moral, not physical, and morality could not be washed with water. As the centuries passed, the ditches deepened, the filth thickened, and generations grew up breathing the same poisoned air. The idea of sanitation belonged to no one's imagination. Water was for drinking or blessing, not for cleansing streets. The cycle of contamination continued, shaping towns into labyrinths of disease that no one recognized as such. The streets remained full, the gutters ran endlessly, and people lived their lives amid the rot, blind to the danger that seeped quietly into every home. The open gutters reflected more than poor infrastructure. They revealed a way of life built on endurance rather than improvement. People learned to live beside filth because survival left no room for disgust. In a world where every day was a struggle, The smell of decay was simply another reminder of life itself. From those streets, a new kind of indifference began to grow, one that would soon touch how they ate, how they washed, and how they cared for their own bodies. Somewhere beyond those ditches, worse habits were already waiting to form. After using the open pits, the act of cleaning oneself was a matter of chance. Paper did not exist for such purposes, and cloth was too precious to be wasted. People used whatever they could find nearby, handfuls of dry grass, leaves, stones, or ash from the hearth. Some simply used their bare hands and rinsed them quickly in the nearest pond or stream. The idea of hygiene did not guide these choices. It was about convenience, not cleanliness. A person might wipe with a straw one day and with soil the next. The methods changed with the seasons, but the indifference remained the same. It is darkly amusing that the most natural act of all was also the most unsanitary, yet few saw the contradiction. In crowded towns, shared pits meant shared habits. The ground around them was littered with discarded materials, clumps of grass, and grey ash scattered like the remnants of a strange ritual. Dogs rolled in the filth, and children played nearby, their small hands touching the same ground. Some people believed wiping too thoroughly could cause illness, arguing that it irritated the body or offended divine order. Others thought leaving waste on the skin was harmless because it was their own. Superstition replaced understanding, and routine replaced awareness. Ash was the most common tool. Every household had a fireplace, and its residue was free and plentiful. People scooped it up with their hands, sometimes still warm, and used it to absorb moisture. The sensation must have been rough and cold, but no one complained. In their minds, the body was meant to endure discomfort. Water was used sparingly, mostly for drinking or cooking. Using it to wash after relieving oneself was rare, and when done, it was often with the same contaminated water that others used for livestock. If compared to today, it would be like cleaning oneself with sand and then washing in a puddle shared by animals. In winter, even ash and straw were scarce. People resorted to snow or frozen soil, scraping at their skin until it reddened. Those who lived near rivers sometimes carried small, smooth stones for the purpose, kept in baskets beside the latrines. Over time, such stones were passed from one person to another, rinsed in dirty water, and used again. Disease travelled silently between hands, stones, and mouths. Yet no one connected these habits to sickness. When illness spread, it was blamed on fate or the will of God, never on the filth beneath one's own nails. Travellers' accounts describe these customs with shock. Foreigners spoke of the smell of unwashed bodies and the dirt that stained garments. Locals, however, saw no reason for shame. To them, the body was not sacred. It was simply a vessel for labour and hunger. Cleanliness belonged to the church, not the home. Priests preached about spiritual purity but ignored the physical one. Washing was seen as an indulgence, wiping as optional. The less attention given to the body, the more virtuous a person seemed. The poor had no means to do better, and the rich often chose not to. Servants might bring buckets of water for noble households, but even there, habits were primitive. Rags were used until they disintegrated, then thrown out and replaced with grass. Chamber pots were emptied by hand, and washing afterward was casual at best. The idea that disease could come from the body itself was too modern for that age. People lived close to their waste because they saw no difference between nature and filth. The absence of paper played a strange role in shaping these customs. When paper finally became available centuries later, it was still too costly to be used for hygiene. Only priests, scholars, and merchants could afford it. For everyone else, ash remained the universal cleanser. It blackened skin and left behind a dry, powdery residue, but people believed it purified the body. They thought fire made things holy, and if ash came from fire, it must carry that same purity. The irony is painful. What they believed was cleansing only spread more disease. It is disturbing to think that ignorance was not born from neglect, but from trust in the wrong kind of purity. In time, these habits became so ordinary that even those who suffered skin infections or sores did not change them. Wounds were seen as signs of divine testing, not the result of poor hygiene. The dirt between fingers and undernails became invisible, part of life's texture. The line between clean and unclean blurred completely. To wipe was a gesture, not a cleansing act. Once done, people simply moved on, ate with the same hands, and touched the same food as others. This casual acceptance of filth reveals a deeper truth about medieval life. Comfort was not a right, but a sin. Pain was a reminder of virtue, and simplicity was mistaken for purity. By denying the body, people believed they were strengthening the soul. What remained was a civilization that lived amid decay yet spoke of holiness. Wiping with ash, straw, or hands was not just a habit of poverty. It was a mirror of belief. It showed how people could survive without questioning what survival cost them. From those bare hands and grey ashes, disease spread quietly through homes and villages. And yet, in their eyes, life went on as it always had. There was still work to do, prayers to say, and food to share, even if that food carried the same dirt from the fields of waste. The ignorance did not end there, for the filth that touched the ground would soon rise again in other forms, in the very water and air they depended on. Bathing was not a habit, but a suspicion. In the medieval world, the act of washing one's body with water was seen as unnecessary, even dangerous. People believed that when the skin was wet, the pores opened and allowed sickness to slip inside. To them, warmth and dryness meant safety, while water was a carrier of disease. The air itself was thought to contain invisible poisons that could enter through those open pores. So, instead of bathing, they chose to stay covered, letting layers of dirt become a kind of armour. It is almost ironic that filth was considered protection, while cleanliness was treated as a risk. Bathhouses had once existed, inherited from the Romans, but over time they fell into ruin. As Christianity spread through Europe, the Church began to view bathing as an indulgent act. Washing too often was said to encourage vanity or tempt the body towards sin. Public baths became places of gossip and immorality, where men and women sometimes shared space behind thin partitions. The clergy warned that water washed not only dirt but also virtue away. Over generations, this belief hardened into social law. To be clean was to be suspicious. Among peasants, bathing was rare simply because it was impractical. Fetching water from a well or river was laborious, and heating it required scarce firewood. Most preferred to save both for cooking and brewing ale. When someone did wash, it was partial, a splash on the face, a rinse of the hands before meals. The rest of the body was left untouched for months, sometimes for years. The smell of sweat and soil was part of identity, a scent that marked one's place in life. If compared to today, it would be like considering a hot shower an act of arrogance instead of hygiene. Even in noble households, baths were exceptional events. Large wooden tubs lined with cloth were filled with buckets of water brought by servants. The master of the house would bathe first, followed by the family, and finally the servants would use the same water, now grey and cold. Soap was scarce, made from animal fat and ashes, and its odour was nearly as unpleasant as the dirt it was meant to remove. After the water cooled, it was poured into the streets or reused for washing clothes. The idea that clean water could be wasted on the body was unthinkable. The Church reinforced these customs with warnings disguised as virtue. Priests taught that the body was a vessel of temptation, and that keeping it covered in dirt helped preserve purity. Monks were instructed to wash only hands and faces, never the whole body, unless illness demanded it. Even then, washing was done secretly, without pleasure. Bathing for comfort was a sin of the flesh, one that blurred the line between discipline and desire. Over centuries, sermons replaced reason, and people obeyed them without question. Illness spreads easily in such conditions. Skin infections, lice, and sores were common, but instead of seeing them as consequences of filth, people believed they were divine tests. Some even claimed that God sent sickness to those who cared too much for the body. The fewer baths one took, the holier one appeared. There were saints who bragged of never washing from birth to death, their dirt a symbol of faith. Ordinary people followed their example, confusing neglect with piety. It still amazes me how the fear of sin could make people reject something as simple as cleanliness. When epidemics swept through Europe, such as the plague, bathing was blamed for making people vulnerable. Those who died were said to have weakened themselves by washing too often. After each outbreak, more people abandoned bathing entirely. They turned instead to perfumes and powders, covering the smell of decay with the illusion of refinement. The wealthy soaked cloths in rose water and rubbed them across the skin, believing scent could replace cleanliness. The poor used herbs, ashes, or even bread crust to scrub away grease, but the result was the same layers of dirt hiding beneath layers of fragrance. The contradiction between belief and experience grew sharper over time. People could see lice crawling on collars and sores forming on arms, yet still refused to connect them to filth. The fear of disease had become entangled with the fear of sin, and together they silenced reason. Children were taught early that washing was unnecessary, that water weakened the body and tempted the soul. Generations passed with this lesson carved into habit. When someone appeared freshly washed, neighbours whispered. A clean face suggested pride, and pride was the first step toward damnation. Travellers from lands with warmer climates often wrote of Europe's smell before they even described its cities. The air inside homes was heavy with sweat, smoke, and the faint scent of rot. Clothes absorbed it, bedding trapped it, and walls breathed it back at night. People tried to cover the odour with burning herbs or scented oils, but nothing could replace the missing habit of washing. A single bath might have eased the stench, yet no one dared to risk it. They believed the discomfort of filth was safer than the danger of water. The fear of bathing lasted for centuries. Even as new ideas about medicine began to spread, many still clung to the old belief that cleanliness invited disease. Doctors struggled to convince patients that washing could heal rather than harm. Some tried to disguise their advice by framing it as moderation rather than indulgence. Still, change came slowly. Custom outweighed logic, and the smell of humanity lingered through castles and cottages alike. The refusal to bathe tells more than a story about dirt. It reveals how belief can shape the body itself, how fear can become stronger than instinct. People endured discomfort not because they had to, but because they thought it made them safe and virtuous. To live without washing was to live under the illusion of moral strength. And so, the medieval world became a place where soap was feared, water distrusted, and the human body left to rot quietly under its own protection. Bathing was not an act of care, but of defiance. Those who dared to wash risked gossip and judgment. Those who refused earned respect. In that reversal of reason lay the essence of medieval life, where purity was defined not by what was clean, but by what was endured. From this mindset, new habits would emerge, stranger still, born from fear and faith mingled together. Somewhere beyond the church walls and the dirt-caked hands, other taboos were waiting to rise. Beds in the medieval world were not places of rest, but nests of discomfort. Most were little more than wooden frames filled with straw, hay, or scraps of old fabric. Over time, the stuffing compacted into uneven lumps, trapping dirt, sweat, and every insect that found its way indoors. The smell of damp straw mixed with human scent created the perfect home for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Each night, when bodies lay down in the dark, the insects came alive, crawling through seams and biting exposed skin. People scratched in their sleep until their arms bled, yet saw no point in complaint. It is almost grimly funny that they called it rest when their beds were alive with things that fed on them. Washing a mattress was nearly impossible. Water ruined straw and fabric, and new stuffing was expensive. So people learned to live with the constant itching. When the discomfort grew unbearable, they simply beat the bedding with sticks or hung it by the window in the cold air, hoping the frost or sun would kill what lived inside. It never truly worked. The creatures always returned, feeding on warmth and blood. Generations slept this way, passing on both the bedding and its hidden population to their children. The idea of sleep as a peaceful escape would have seemed foreign to them. To lie down was to endure. The poor often shared a single bed among several family members. Parents, children, and even livestock huddled together in the same small space for warmth. The straw beneath them absorbed sweat, spilled ale, and the scent of animals. Fleas thrived in it, hopping easily from body to body. For many, waking up with bites was as ordinary as feeling hungry. If compared to today, it would be like sleeping each night on a garbage heap and calling it home. Clean sheets, soft pillows, and privacy were dreams for the wealthy, not rights for the common. Even in the homes of nobles, luxury did not mean cleanliness. Beds might be covered in silks or lined with furs, but beneath the fine layers was the same decaying stuffing. Servants brushed and shook the covers, sprinkling herbs to mask the smell. Yet no one truly removed the dirt. Perfume could not drown the odour of rot. Aristocrats scratched just like peasants, only with better bedding. Doctors advised changing a straw once a year, a rule few followed. Replacing it too often was considered wasteful, and dirt was accepted as a part of comfort. The insects themselves were an inescapable part of medieval life. Bedbugs flattened into tiny crevices during the day and emerged at night, leaving small dots of blood on sheets. Lice clung to hair and clothing, while fleas leapt from person to person, carrying disease. Entire villages scratched in unison, the sound of nails against skin as common as church bells. People used combs, ashes, and vinegar to fight infestations. But nothing lasted long. The insects always came back. It still amazes me how people could mistake survival for adaptation, learning to live with suffering instead of solving it. Because privacy was rare, many slept in shared halls or inns where dozens lay side by side. Travellers often carried their own straw mats, but even these quickly became infested. The beds of strangers were indistinguishable from one's own. It was not uncommon for people to wake covered in bites, shrug, and go about their day. A good night's sleep was not defined by comfort but by exhaustion. If one was tired enough to ignore the itching, that was victory enough. In monasteries, the situation was hardly better. Monks slept in long rows of simple beds, each filled with the same straw as the fields outside. Silence at night was broken by the scratching of hands and the shifting of restless bodies. Cleanliness was seen as vanity, so even when infestations spread, monks endured them as part of their devotion. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as a test of humility. To complain about insects was to complain about God's will. The lack of washing extended beyond bedding. Blankets and nightclothes were seldom cleaned. When the smell became too strong, people aired them out or sprinkled dried herbs between folds. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were popular, not for beauty, but for survival. The scent masked the stench just long enough to forget it. Dust mixed with skin flakes until the fabric itself grew heavy. Over the years, the bed became a record of every night spent within it, a map of sweat, blood, and time. Illnesses spread easily through these sleeping arrangements. Fleas carried plague, lice spread fever, and rashes became infected in unwashed wounds. Yet few connected their suffering to their beds. The human body was seen as weak by nature, not harmed by filth. Death from infection was treated as fate, not consequence. Even when epidemics thinned towns, No one blamed the straw or the insects living inside it. The bed, that symbol of rest, was the silent accomplice in countless deaths. Despite this, the image of a bed still carried comfort in the collective mind. It was where families gathered, where births and deaths occurred. People prayed beside it, ate on it, and spent winters huddled under its covers. The same straw that caused pain also held memory and warmth. To them, the scratching at night was a small price for survival. What they called home was built from the materials of endurance, not safety. A medieval bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a microcosm of the world outside. It carried dirt, disease, and life in equal measure. The insects crawling through the straw were no different from the poverty crawling through society. Both were tolerated, both ignored. From within that restless darkness, people dreamed of heaven, perhaps because it was the only place they imagined clean. The bed, once a refuge, had become another form of labour, endured each night with quiet resignation. Sleep in that world meant sharing your body with the unseen. Every bite, every itch, was a reminder of life's closeness to decay. Yet still they lay down, night after night, beneath the same rough blankets, surrounded by the same hungry creatures. Habit was stronger than horror, and fatigue stronger than disgust. The bed was their world, and their world was filled with crawling things that never rested. Somewhere within that scratching silence, new habits of denial were born, preparing them for even filthier corners of their daily life. Clothes in the medieval world were not washed so much as endured. Most garments were worn for weeks or months without cleaning, until the fabric grew stiff from layers of sweat, oil, and dirt. Washing was considered unnecessary, sometimes even harmful, both to the material and to the soul. Instead, people hung their clothes under the sun, believing its warmth could chase away bad spirits and foul smells. The sunlight became their soap, and the wind their only form of cleansing. It is almost laughable that shining a shirt in the breeze was mistaken for washing, yet to them it was proof of care. Fabric was valuable, often the most expensive thing a person owned. A single tunic could last for years, patched and mended until it no longer held its original colour. To soak it in water risked shrinking or weakening the cloth. For peasants who owned only one or two outfits, losing a garment meant nakedness, so they clung to what they had, keeping it dry at all costs. Sweat and grime hardened the fibres, and the smell of the body became one with the fabric. Clothes were not changed but layered. Each new season added another thickness of filth. The sun was trusted more than water. People believed light itself held cleansing power, that warmth could drive away disease and evil. On washing days, they hung their garments over fences or tree branches, watching them flutter in the breeze like banners of endurance. The air carried the illusion of freshness. From a distance, the sight of clean colours moving in sunlight gave comfort, but up close, the stench told the truth. If compared to today, it would be like leaving clothes outside for a week and calling them freshly laundered. Soap was rare and precious, made from animal fat and ashes. Its cost too high for the poor. Even those who could afford it used it sparingly, rubbing only collars or sleeves before rinsing in dirty river water. The soap itself left behind a sour odour that mixed with the smell of the body. Fabrics were rough, and repeated washing wore them thin. People learned quickly that avoiding water preserved their clothing longer. Dirt, in a strange way, became protection. A stiff, greasy tunic might be uncomfortable, but at least it didn't fall apart. The wealthy were not much cleaner. Nobles often owned several sets of clothing, but they, too, relied on air and perfume more than washing. Servants brushed the garments with stiff bristles or wiped them with vinegar-soaked cloths, then left them in the sun. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat from the skin, meant to protect the outer layers, but these too were rarely washed. When the odour grew overwhelming, fresh herbs were sewn into seams, or powders sprinkled inside collars. The result was a body that smelled of flowers and decay at once. For the poor, rivers and ponds served as both water source and wash-house, yet few dared to submerge their clothing completely. The water was cold, muddy, and filled with waste. To wash meant standing for hours in filth, scrubbing until hands cracked and bled. Even then, the clothes never felt truly clean. The residue of dirt always returned, drying into pale stains that hardened the fabric once again. Many gave up entirely, preferring to hang their clothes in sunlight and pray for the smell to fade. The belief that washing could invite sickness spread easily. Wet clothes were thought to cling to the skin and weaken the body. Parents warned children not to wear freshly washed garments, fearing they would catch chills or fever. Drying in the open air, however, was seen as safe and even holy. Some said the sun's rays purified what water could not. Washing was not an act of cleanliness but a risk, and so neglect became wisdom. The line between superstition and practicality blurred until they were the same thing. Festivals and weddings were often the only times when true washing took place. In preparation for these events, women gathered by the rivers, beating garments against stones and hanging them in lines that stretched across fields. For a few days, the village shimmered with colour. The smell of soap and wet cloth filled the air, but once the celebration ended, so did the effort. Clothes returned to the same routine, hung, aired, and reworn until they could no longer bear their own weight. The bright colours faded to the same dull brown of the earth they lived on. Clothing carried a person's history in every stain. Farmers' tunics were marked by soil and sweat, while city dwellers bore traces of smoke and ash. Washing would have erased these records, and perhaps that, too, made people reluctant. Their garments were part of their identity, visible proof of labour and endurance. In a world where survival mattered more than appearance, dirt became a symbol of honesty. Cleanliness, when seen, was often mocked as prideful or vain. To look spotless was to seem idle. Over time, the practice of hanging clothes in the sun became a ritual. Mothers taught daughters the best hours of light, the angles that dried fastest, the scents of grass that helped disguise sweat. This routine gave the illusion of control, though it changed nothing. The sun bleached the fabric but never removed the filth inside. Still, people believed. They looked at garments stiff with grime and saw them as renewed. Belief was easier than effort, and appearance more powerful than truth. The unwashed clothing of the medieval world told more than a story of poverty. It revealed the stubbornness of habit. People learned to live inside their own odour, blind to what it meant. Dirt did not disgust them because it was universal. Everyone smelled. Everyone endured. The sun shone on filth and purity alike, and that sameness made life bearable. Under its light, the illusion of cleanliness thrived. Clothes dried in the wind were not clean, only emptied of their shame for a moment. When people put them back on, the same stains pressed against their skin, the same smell returned, but they no longer noticed. Habit had replaced awareness, and belief had replaced knowledge. Within that quiet acceptance, a new kind of neglect was forming, one that would stretch from their bodies to their homes, turning even rest itself into another silent struggle with dirt. Hair in the medieval world carried the story of its owner. It was rarely washed, often left untouched for weeks or even months. Water was seen as something to drink, not something to waste on hair. People believed wetting the head too often could cause headaches or even madness. So instead they relied on combs carved from wood or bone, dragging them through knots stiff with oil and dirt. For many, even that was a luxury. Fingers served as the only tools of grooming, pulling through tangles that clung like rope. It is strangely humorous that they believed scraping at filth could replace washing it away. The air in their homes did not help. Fires burned all day, filling rooms with smoke that settled into hair like ash. The strands absorbed the scent of food, sweat, and the dampness of unventilated air. Over time, The build-up turned hair into a solid mass, shiny not from health, but from grease. Dust mixed with oil until it thickened into grey patches that clung to the scalp. Lice found these places perfect for breeding. They laid eggs close to the roots, hidden beneath layers of grime. When people scratched, the eggs broke, releasing more insects into the hair and onto clothing. Yet no one saw this as unusual. It was simply the way life was lived. For women, hair was both burden and pride. It was rarely cut, often covered with veils or coifs that trapped sweat and dirt. Washing it meant uncovering the head, which modesty forbade except in private. The coverings, made from linen or wool, were seldom cleaned either, and they absorbed the same oils and odours. A married woman might go years without feeling water on her scalp. To her, cleanliness came from combing and braiding, from keeping the filth orderly. If compared to today, it would be like styling hair with cooking oil and calling it polished. Men faced their own version of the same habit. Labourers worked under the sun, their hair thick with dust and sweat. Those who wore caps or hoods found that the heat made the smell worse. Soldiers returning from campaign often shaved their heads to escape lice, while priests kept their tonsures clean only by cutting close to the scalp. But even they avoided frequent washing, fearing it would weaken the body. The dirt of the head was thought to be a shield, not a danger. The thicker the layer of oil, the stronger the protection. Barbers existed, but their work was not what it is now. They cut, bled, and sometimes washed hair, but only for special occasions. When someone visited a barber, it was often to mark an event, a wedding, a feast, or the joining of a guild. Between such days, the hair returned to its natural state heavy, darkened, and crawling. Oils made from animal fat were sometimes rubbed into the tangles. The result was hair that glistened like wet leather and smelled the same. The smell was part of daily life. It lingered in the air like smoke and blended with everything else. When two people passed each other in the street, their mingled odours told stories, one of work, one of hunger, one of survival. Clean hair had no meaning because there was no example of it. Even among the rich, perfumes were used to mask filth rather than remove it. The scent of rose or lavender might hide the odour for an hour, but the grease beneath remained. Some nobles wore small pouches of herbs pinned near their heads, a mobile disguise against their own smell. Children suffered the most. Their small heads were easy targets for lice, and their mothers, without soap or patience, often shaved them entirely. The hair would grow back, thick and dark, carrying the same pattern of neglect. When they scratched until they bled, the wounds scabbed and hardened, adding another layer of discomfort. Teachers in schools complained of the stench of unwashed pupils, yet did nothing to change it. The problem was not one child or one family, it was everyone. Illness followed this neglect. Infected scalps, sores, and fevers spread silently through villages. Yet people continued to fear water more than disease. The belief that washing could invite sickness held stronger than any evidence of its benefits. Even when doctors advised cleansing, they often suggested wiping with vinegar or rubbing with ashes instead of using clean water. The head was seen as delicate, too sacred for soaking. To immerse it in water was to tempt fate. The connection between hygiene and dignity was still centuries away. For medieval people, dirt was not humiliation. It was the skin of survival. To remove it was to strip away the sign of labour. Workers wore their grime with quiet pride, a symbol of endurance. Hair that smelled of smoke and sweat was proof of effort, not shame. Cleanliness belonged to angels and saints, not to those who toiled. This acceptance created its own quiet blindness. People forgot what clean felt like. They forgot the lightness of washed hair, the coolness of water against skin. Generations passed without that simple relief, replacing it with belief and routine. Even when lice became unbearable, they cursed the insects, not the habit that fed them. They did not see the difference between what was natural and what was neglected. Hair in that age was more than a part of the body. It was a living record of poverty, faith, and resignation. It carried the smell of kitchens, fields, and fear, a blend that defined the human scent of the era. Each strand trapped a trace of smoke, a layer of oil, and the dust of endless labour. Yet when they looked at one another, no one recoiled. They saw themselves reflected in the same sheen of filth. To them, this was not dirt. It was life itself. Hair unwashed, tangled, and heavy became a silent emblem of their world. It was both armour and burden, worn proudly and suffered quietly. When the wind blew through the village, it stirred the smell of humanity itself, a fragrance of work, worship, and decay. And in that familiar odour they found comfort, unaware that the same hair carrying their identity also carried the seeds of their sickness. Feet were the closest part of the body to the truth of medieval life. They met the ground that carried waste, ash, and decay, and they had no protection from it. Shoes were a privilege, not a necessity. Most of the poor walked barefoot every day, their soles hardened by dirt and cold. Even when they entered the toilet pits or walked through the streets lined with open gutters, their feet remained bare, each step pressed into mud mixed with excrement, animal remains, and refuse thrown from windows. The skin cracked under the strain, and the cracks filled with grime that never came out. It is almost unbelievable that people accepted walking through filth as natural, but for them, there was no other way. Those who owned shoes guarded them like treasures. A single pair might last a lifetime, mended again and again until only scraps remained. Leather was costly, and wooden clogs were heavy, unsuited for long walks, so most villagers went without. The feet became a tool of survival, tough, scarred, and numb. Children learned to ignore pain early, hopping over sharp stones or frozen puddles with the same ease they breathed. The earth itself became their shoe, a second skin of soil and infection. The poorer the village, the more bare feet it held. When rain fell, the streets turned into rivers of filth. Waste from ditches and animals flowed freely, soaking everything. Those who walked barefoot sank into it without hesitation. The sensation of wetness and decay became so common that it stopped feeling disgusting. When the weather turned dry, the same filth hardened into dust and clung to their skin like another layer of flesh. At night, people slept with their feet still black, the dirt pressed into blankets of straw. No one washed before bed. Water was too precious to waste on something as trivial as feet. The constant exposure brought infection. Cuts from stones or glass festered quickly, swelling into red sores. In summer, flies gathered around them, laying eggs in open wounds. In winter, frostbite took the same limbs, turning skin grey before it cracked and peeled away. Still, people carried on. There was work to be done, and pain was only another companion. A swollen foot might slow someone down, but stopping meant hunger. If compared to today, it would be like walking every day through a garbage-filled river with open wounds and calling it normal life. The stench of unwashed feet filled homes just as the smell of smoke and sweat did. It mingled with the air, absorbed by the floor rushes and blankets. Even in churches, where cleanliness was preached as divine, bare feet pressed into cold stone aisles. The faithful knelt before the altar, unaware that the same feet that touched sacred ground carried the dirt of the streets and the waste of animals. Shoes were sometimes removed as a sign of humility, though in truth, most had none to remove. The infection of the feet was so common that it barely counted as an illness. Red sores, blisters, and rotting toes were ordinary. Some people wrapped rags around their feet for warmth or protection, but the cloth quickly grew foul and damp. When the infection spread, it climbed upward through the leg, turning the skin black. Amputation was impossible for most, and death came quietly, disguised as fever or fatigue. Families buried their dead without knowing the cause, only that it began with a small cut. I find it disturbing that such slow suffering became invisible simply because it was shared by everyone. Among the rich, shoes served as both armour and symbol. Soft leather boots, lined with fur, marked the difference between those who walked above filth and those who lived in it. But even fine shoes could not escape the conditions of the streets. The soles collected the same waste, and the odour of decay followed their wearers indoors. Servants cleaned the boots, scraping off mud that was not just earth but everything the town produced. In a world without clean water, no one truly escaped the dirt. Children suffered the worst of all. Their small feet, still soft, were torn open by pebbles and splinters. Mothers rubbed animal fat on their wounds, thinking it would heal them, but the fat attracted more dirt instead. Many children limped for life from untreated injuries. Those who lost toes or feet were seen as victims of fate, not of hygiene. A crippled child could still beg, and begging was as much a part of survival as walking. In monasteries, monks went barefoot as a sign of devotion. They believed that walking unprotected brought them closer to the suffering of Christ. The stones of the cloister floors were cold and sharp, but they took comfort in that pain. Dirt on their feet was a badge of humility, not a stain. The act of washing another's feet during certain rituals was meant to symbolize purity, yet in practice, it was one of the few times water ever touched them. The gesture was sacred precisely because it was rare. The medieval foot carried the world's filth, but also its endurance. It bore the weight of fields, markets, and wars, and it never rested clean. To walk was to suffer, and to stop was to die. The line between ground and flesh blurred until they became one, a single surface of dirt and survival. People did not dream of comfort because they had never known it. They simply walked until they could not. Feet hardened by filth were more than a sign of poverty. They were the foundation of the age itself. Every path, every street, every floor was shaped by the same contact between skin and soil. And beneath that layer of dust and disease, an understanding formed that life, no matter how painful, could still move forward. From those bare, cracked feet, humanity carried itself through centuries of dirt, each step a quiet acceptance of the suffering below. Meals in the medieval home were not moments of comfort, but extensions of daily survival. Families gathered where there was space, often at the same wooden table where they worked, sewed, or even butchered animals. The table usually stood only a few steps from the bed and not far from the chamber pot. In small cottages, there was no separation between living, sleeping, and eating. The smell of waste mixed easily with that of food, rising from the same dirt floors that had absorbed years of filth. The air was thick, warm, and heavy, filled with smoke, sweat, and the sour scent of human closeness. It is grimly amusing that people believed the smell of their own bodies could not harm them. Plates and utensils were rare. Food was served in wooden bowls or directly on the table, where everyone reached with their hands. Washing before eating was uncommon. Water was too precious to waste on something invisible like germs. Dirt from the fields and soot from the hearth clung to their fingers as they tore bread or scooped stew. The same hands that tended animals or emptied waste were the hands that fed children. In wealthier homes, knives were shared, wiped on a cloth that was seldom clean. Eating was a communal act, not only in spirit, but in bacteria. The table became an invisible bridge between every mouth, every illness. The smell of meals matched the world around them. Smoke from the fire soaked into the meat, but beneath it lay the faint odour of damp hay, of unwashed skin, and of refuse decaying outside the door. In summer, flies swarmed over food and faces alike, landing again and again until ignored. People waved them away lazily, too used to their company to care. If compared to today, it would be like dining beside a latrine and calling it home cooking. Meals were moments of routine, not pleasure. The taste of salt, smoke, and fat dominated every dish, masking what freshness could not be found. Soups and stews were cooked over open flames in blackened pots, sometimes flavoured with whatever vegetables had not yet spoiled. The aroma of food mingled with the odour of sweat and damp clothing, creating a perfume unique to that age. To the medieval nose, it was ordinary, comforting even. A room without that blend of smells would have felt strange, lifeless. Clean air was not the sign of purity but of emptiness. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, eating from the same bowl as their parents. Dogs circled beneath the table, licking up spills. Cats climbed onto benches, stealing bits of meat while no one stopped them. The line between human and animal behaviour blurred during every meal. Hunger erased politeness. Food was survival, and manners were a luxury for those who never knew real scarcity. For most, the act of eating was not sacred. It was practical, swift, and sometimes desperate. Even in towns, where families lived closer together, the smells did not improve. Market air brought the scent of fish, manure, and rot into every home. Windows were small and rarely opened, keeping both heat and odour trapped inside. The smell of meals mixed with the stench of waste from the gutters outside. Bread baked beside open drains, and soup simmered while flies crawled across the rim of the pot. Those who had noses sensitive to such things did not live long enough to complain. Festive days only made the situation louder, not cleaner. When neighbours gathered to celebrate weddings or harvests, the air became a storm of smells. Roasting meat, sweat, spilled ale, and the ever-present odour of human bodies clashed together. Laughter filled the air, masking discomfort. People did not mind the closeness because they had never known another way. Cleanliness had no social value. What mattered was abundance. A full table made a home respectable, even if it stood beside a heap of waste. Servants, when present, were responsible for cleaning after meals. They used scraps of old bread to wipe the table, tossing the crumbs onto the floor for the dogs or chickens. The concept of disinfecting did not exist. What looked tidy was considered clean, and what was out of sight was forgotten. In this world, filth was not hidden. It was simply accepted. To complain about it would have been to question life itself. I often find it unsettling how silence became the only form of cleanliness available to them. Illness after eating was common. Foodborne sickness swept through families regularly, though no one blamed the environment. When someone fell ill, it was chalked up to spoiled food, bad luck, or divine will. The idea that the filth around them played a role never crossed their minds. Even physicians of the time believed that odour alone, rather than the waste itself, carried disease. To fight it, they burned herbs and incense, filling rooms with thick smoke that only added another layer to the already suffocating air. To modern eyes, these meals might seem unbearable. The mixture of decay and routine, of laughter and filth, feels impossible to imagine. Yet, within those homes, the smells became part of identity, just as their food did. Each scent marked the rhythm of life, binding people together in shared tolerance. The house smelled of them, and they smelled of the house. To be alive was to breathe it in. Eating beside waste was not carelessness. It was the only choice. Space was limited, and comfort was unknown. Families gathered close because warmth and food were rare. Cleanliness had no place in such priorities. The smell of the home, however foul, meant survival. They ate, they prayed, and they slept amid the same air, never realizing how much it consumed them. The medieval meal was not just about hunger, it was a reflection of their entire world. It combined filth, faith, and familiarity into a single experience. Each bite carried the taste of endurance. Each breath drew in centuries of dirt. From that mixture of odours and habits, a way of life was born. one that blurred the lines between comfort and contamination, and as their tables rotted quietly beside their beds, another hidden danger waited where they least expected it. Water, the very thing meant to sustain life, was one of the deadliest substances in the medieval world. Wells and ponds that shimmered under the sun looked clean enough, but beneath their surface lay the remains of everything that lived and died nearby. People and animals shared the same sources, their waste sinking into the soil until it blended with the water table. The result was a silent poison disguised as purity. Villagers lowered their wooden buckets, filled them to the brim, and carried death home in every drop. It is both tragic and absurd that what they trusted most was what destroyed them. The idea of boiling water was almost unknown. Firewood was scarce and saved for cooking, not for cleansing. Water was drunk cold, scooped directly from wells, rivers, or ponds. Its clarity was the only test people trusted. If it looked clear, they believed it was safe. They had no concept of bacteria, no understanding that something invisible could harm them. The rich tried to make water more palatable by mixing it with wine or ale, calling it refinement. The poor did the same out of desperation, hoping that a little alcohol might dull the taste of dirt. They called it purification, but it was only an illusion. In cities, water ran through open drains before reaching the buckets of the people. Waste from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and homes flowed into the same channels that fed the wells. The smell was sometimes unbearable, yet still, people drank. The thirst of work and heat left them no choice. Children filled clay cups, mothers poured it into soups, and travellers gulped it down on dusty roads. Within hours, the cramps would start, sharp pain, fever, and endless sickness. Entire families fell ill at once, yet no one thought to question the water. To them, illness was as natural as weather. Doctors called it the flux, a polite name for diarrhea that emptied bodies faster than they could be fed. Villagers lost children every summer, their small graves dug beside the same streams that had poisoned them. Yet still, people returned to drink. Priests preached prayers for strength instead of warning against the wells. Some even claimed that the sickness came from sin rather than filth, and repentance was the only cure. Faith became medicine, and medicine was replaced by luck. If compared to today, it would be like drinking from a gutter running through a slaughterhouse and calling it holy water. The contamination spread beyond homes. Inns served travellers the same water, ladled from barrels that were rarely emptied. Market stalls offered drinks flavoured with herbs or fruit, but the base was always the same, unfiltered, unboiled, alive with things unseen. Even the barrels that held wine or ale were sometimes rinsed with infected water, mixing purity with decay. Disease travelled faster than trade, carried not by armies or merchants, but by thirst itself. The poor had no alternatives. Rainwater collected in pits turned green with algae, but it was still better than nothing. People strained it through cloth, more out of habit than knowledge, thinking that if the water looked clearer, it must be safer. But the cloth was rarely clean, often used again and again until it smelled of rot. What passed through it was only a little less cloudy, not less deadly. When people died, their families grieved briefly and then returned to the same well. No one questioned the circle of sickness. To doubt it would mean doubting life itself. The rich thought themselves safer, but their fountains were only decorated versions of the same source. Pipes of lead carried water into homes, and the poison of the metal joined the filth of the earth. Nobles sipped from silver cups, confident in their refinement, never realizing that their luxury was also killing them. The taste of purity was an illusion sustained by ignorance. Even royalty could not escape the reach of the invisible. The higher the rank, the deeper the well, but the same disease waited at the bottom. When travellers described these conditions, foreign readers doubted them. How could a civilization so proud of its faith and progress drink such filth? Yet the truth was that filth was everywhere, accepted, baptized, and invisible. People had grown so used to suffering that they stopped calling it suffering. A bad stomach was part of life, just as coughing was part of winter and sores were part of labour. No one sought to cure what everyone endured. The churchyards themselves became part of the problem. Graves were dug shallow and allowed decomposition to seep into nearby wells. During heavy rains, the runoff carried decay through the soil and into the streams. Water, once sacred in baptism, became the quiet carrier of death. The same element that washed souls in holy rituals destroyed bodies in everyday life. And yet, no one saw a contradiction in it. The faithful drank, prayed, and died with the same acceptance, as though purity and poison were two names for the same thing. The pattern repeated for centuries. Towns grew, populations swelled, and still no one changed their habits. Water remained a mystery, both feared and needed. To live without it was impossible, but to live with it was often fatal. Even when physicians began to suspect contamination, their warnings went unheard. Knowledge was useless without belief, and belief belonged to tradition. Water in the medieval world was not life. It was a mirror of ignorance. It reflected the human refusal to see what was hidden, to question what felt ordinary. Every drop carried the memory of those who drank before, the dead mingling with the living in an endless, invisible communion. And from that poisoned purity, a new understanding would one day rise. Too late for those who learned it through thirst and death. Dead animals were as common a sight in medieval towns as market stalls or church towers. Cats, dogs, and livestock that had reached the end of their use were thrown into empty lots or ditches just beyond the homes that once sheltered them. There was no shame in it, no ceremony. A body was a burden once it stopped moving. The sun baked the carcasses by day, the rain softened them by night, and the air grew thick with the slow rot of fur and flesh. The smell did not fade, it lingered, mixing with the scent of smoke and sewage until the entire village breathed decay. It is almost absurd that the stench of death became so normal that no one thought it strange. The earth near these dumping grounds turned black from the fluids that seeped out. Flies gathered in clouds, feeding and breeding, their buzzing a constant sound that hummed through summer air. Rats arrived soon after, drawn by the feast. They dug through the remains, spreading what they carried on their fur into homes and storerooms. Disease travelled silently through their movements, but no one made the connection. To most, rats were simply part of life, and flies were just another annoyance. The true horror lay in how ordinary it all felt. When an animal died inside the house, it was dragged outside by the tail and left behind the fence. Some families tossed the carcass into the same ditch where they threw broken pots and scraps of food. There were no designated areas, no burial pits, only convenience. The smell of rot drifted into kitchens and sleeping rooms alike, absorbed into the wooden beams of homes. Children played nearby, swatting at flies without realizing what they fed on. The boundary between life and death was measured in steps, not miles. In larger towns, the problem only grew. The streets were narrow and crowded, and space to bury anything was scarce. Butchers dumped waste from slaughtered animals in the same alleys where people walked. Hides, bones, and offal piled up until rain washed them away, or until dogs dragged them apart. The sight of carcasses was not shocking, it was expected. Every corner had its own smell, a mix of tallow, dung, and decomposition. When the wind blew, the air became heavy, carrying the taste of death onto the tongue. If compared to today, it would be like living beside an open landfill where no one complains because they've forgotten what clean air feels like. Scavenger animals thrived in this world. Stray dogs fought over bones, crows pecked at carcasses, and pigs rooted through piles of waste. Each creature spread disease further, though to the human eye, it seemed like nature cleaning itself. People trusted that the earth and its animals would take care of the dead. Time would remove what they left behind. In truth, The earth did take it back, but slowly, through a process that filled the air with sickness. There were moments of effort. Town officials sometimes ordered cleanings before festivals or religious events, sending workers to collect corpses and burn them outside the gates. But these were rare, and the fires themselves brought their own stench. Thick smoke rolled over the fields, turning the air grey. People shut their windows but still breathed it in. When the smoke cleared, the waste returned. A few days later, new bodies replaced the old. I often think there is nothing more frightening than how quickly people grow used to decay when it surrounds them every day. The neglect was not born from cruelty but from necessity. Life was labour, and death was routine. Farmers buried large animals when they could, but smaller ones were left to the elements. The same hands that milked cows or gathered grain were too tired to dig holes for cats or chickens. Even noble households, with servants and land, were guilty of the same laziness. Dead horses from carriages were dragged to the outskirts of towns, their carcasses bloating in the sun while children stared and held their noses. The smell was unbearable for a day, then became part of the air once more. In some places, the presence of decay was even considered useful. People believed the odour of rot could ward off worse diseases. Physicians carried cloths soaked in vinegar to block the smell, thinking it kept them safe. The logic twisted itself into acceptance if death was everywhere, then perhaps it served a purpose. Few realised that the very air they feared was already poisoned. The stronger the smell, the more it reassured them that corruption had found its place and would soon fade. Night made everything worse. Without light, the outlines of carcasses blended with the earth. Feet stepped on bones, carts rolled over remains, and the crunch under the wheels became just another sound in the street. Rats swarmed more freely, unseen but always present. Their squeaks echoed through alleys where people slept. Death was not separate from life. It was woven into the routine, waiting quietly in every breath. The fields outside towns were worse still. The ground there was uneven, dotted with shallow graves that were never deep enough. Heavy rains exposed what had been buried, scattering bones and fur across the soil. Farmers ignored them as they worked, kicking them aside with their boots. Over time, the earth became a patchwork of burial and growth, each harvest touched by the remnants of what came before. The medieval landscape was an open tomb, filled with the evidence of survival without order. There was no sanitation, no sense of boundary between the living and the dead. What mattered was that the world kept moving, no matter what it smelled like. Death did not interrupt life, it coexisted with it. People learned to live among corpses just as they lived among filth, blind to what it cost them. The flies, the rats, and the scent of decay became the pulse of their world, constant and unchanging. Death was not a visitor in that time, it was a neighbour. It stood outside every door, lay in every field, and whispered in every gust of wind. Within that quiet decay, something darker was beginning to stir in the air they breathed and the food they ate, something that would soon remind them how close death had always been. Intimacy in the medieval world was not followed by cleanliness, but by neglect. The act itself ended, and life continued as if nothing required tending. There was no idea of washing afterward, no sense that what clung to the body might carry danger. Sweat, blood, and other traces remained on the skin and the sheets until they dried and became part of the fabric. The same bed that held rest also held remnants of countless nights before. The smell of flesh, damp linen, and stale air mingled into something thick and sour. It is both ironic and disturbing that what was considered natural affection was often the beginning of slow decay. The bed was rarely changed. Straw or old fabric served as bedding, and both absorbed everything. When couples lie together, their warmth turns the dirt beneath them soft again, releasing old smells trapped in the floor rushes. The mixture of bodily fluids and dust formed a crust that stayed through seasons. Washing sheets required water, soap, and labour. things too costly to waste. The same blanket used for sleep was used for birth, illness, and death. In many homes, a bed was not a symbol of comfort but of continuity, shared by generations and never truly clean. After intercourse, there was no ritual of washing, not even for the rich. Water was used sparingly, and bathing after such acts was discouraged by both custom and religion. The church taught restraint, not hygiene. Cleanliness was seen as vanity, a temptation of the flesh rather than a protection of it. People believed that what the body produced was natural and therefore harmless. Men wiped themselves on straw or cloth, women on their skirts or the bedding, and both turned away to sleep. It was not shameful. It was simply life. If compared to today, it would be like sleeping in the same sheets for years, soaked in sweat and blood, without ever realizing it was killing you slowly. The result was a world where disease spread quietly between lovers, spouses, and entire communities. The idea of infection did not exist. When a woman fell ill, her suffering was blamed on sin or weakness. When men developed sores or fevers, it was said to be punishment for lust, not the consequence of neglect. Sexually transmitted diseases flourished in silence, passing from bed to bed like invisible ghosts, in brothels, in taverns, and even in noble houses. Pleasure carried a cost no one could name. The smell of the body was constant. In the absence of soap, perfumes and herbs were used to mask odour rather than remove it. Women rubbed oils or flowers on their skin, but the base of dirt and sweat remained. Men used wine or vinegar on cloth to wipe themselves, believing it purified the body. These gestures were symbolic, not effective. The surface appeared cared for while the sickness brewed underneath. I cannot help but think that ignorance, more than poverty, was the real disease of that age. Beds themselves were breeding grounds for contagion. Sheets were shared by family members, travellers, or servants. What began as a fever in one person could spread through the entire household. It was not uncommon for a man to sleep where another had died only days before. The warmth of the human body revived the insects and bacteria hidden in the fabric. When lovers embraced, they also embraced the residue of every life that had touched that bed before them. In brothels, the situation was worse. The same straw mattresses were used night after night, soaked through with fluids and rarely replaced. The air in those rooms was heavy, thick with heat and sickness. The workers washed themselves with cheap wine or cold water when they could, but the act was brief and desperate. Their survival depended on endurance, not health. For many, the body was both their living and their slow ruin. Diseases moved through those places like rumours, spreading faster than anyone could understand. Even among the wealthy, indulgence replaced cleanliness. Perfumed oils were poured over the skin to hide odour, and elaborate bed linens were aired in sunlight but never washed. Servants were instructed to shake out the blankets rather than scrub them. Appearances mattered. Purity did not. In royal courts, where sin was preached against but practiced freely, courtiers whispered prayers for health while sleeping on the same sheets that had carried illness to others. The irony was invisible to them, as invisible as the microbes they ignored. When sickness struck, it was treated with superstition. Healers prescribed charms, prayers, and potions made of herbs or metals. No one connected the illness to the act itself. To speak of hygiene in such a context would have sounded foolish. The very notion of clean was moral, not physical. Water cleanses sin through baptism, not disease through washing. The result was a world where devotion replaced knowledge and suffering was seen as destiny. To modern minds, the idea of such disregard feels impossible. Yet for centuries, it was the norm. What was shared between people in the name of love often became a curse carried in silence. The absence of understanding turned intimacy into one of the most dangerous acts a person could perform. The body, meant to bring closeness, became a vessel for death. Sex in medieval times was not secretive or shameful. It was simply unexamined. The concept of aftermath did not exist, and the boundaries between pleasure and disease dissolved into the same darkness that filled their homes each night. The sheets beneath them whispered the stories of countless lives, blending desire, ignorance, and infection into one. Within that silence, something else began to take hold, something deeper than neglect, a belief that even blood itself carried mystery, one that would soon demand its own kind of ritual. Menstruation in the medieval world was a secret carried in silence. Women hid their blood not because they were ashamed of it, but because everyone else believed they should be. It was not spoken of in homes, not taught by mothers, and never acknowledged by men. The body's natural rhythm was treated as a sign of impurity, something to be hidden like sin. When the flow came, women reached for whatever they had: old cloth, scraps of linen, dried moss, or leaves. Many had nothing at all. The blood ran freely beneath their clothes, soaking through layers of fabric and straw bedding. It is both tragic and absurd that what was most natural to life was treated as something unclean and forbidden. Those who had bits of fabric washed and reused them until they fell apart. There was no soap, no disinfectant, only cold water that barely removed the stain. The cloth was often hidden under other garments while drying indoors, since hanging it in the open was said to bring misfortune. Superstition ruled the body more than knowledge did. Women believed that showing menstrual cloth to the sunlight might anger spirits or spoil crops, so the smell of blood lingered in the corners of rooms, behind furniture, or inside wooden chests. It became part of the air they breathed, a faint metallic odour that no one dared to name. Pain was endured without question. There were no remedies for cramps or weakness, no comfort beyond waiting. A woman who complained was told that her suffering was divine punishment for Eve's sin. Menstruation was not seen as a biological process but as a spiritual debt. Priests reminded women to stay away from holy spaces during their bleeding days, claiming that their presence could defile the sacred. For many, faith became another barrier between them and their own bodies. If compared to today, it would be like being forbidden to enter a building because of a wound you did not cause. In villages, young girls often learned about menstruation only when it began. Their mothers, embarrassed or afraid, offered little explanation. A girl's first blood was seen as a warning, not a milestone. She was told to keep quiet, to hide her clothes, to never let a man see them. The fear of shame was greater than the fear of infection. Blood soaked into garments, left to dry and stiffen, then worn again. The risk of illness grew, but no one spoke of it. Odour became as ordinary as breathing. Among the wealthy, the situation differed little. Noble women used fine linen or wool padding, but they too hid it in secret. Servants washed their garments in cold water at night, away from prying eyes. The shame was social, not financial. Cleanliness could not erase impurity if society declared it a sacred law. In court, women pretended their bodies did not bleed, and men pretended to believe them. The silence was mutual, thick, and unbroken. The smell of menstrual blood filled homes quietly. In crowded cottages, there was no escape from it. It mixed with the scent of smoke, sweat, and animal dung, becoming one more layer of existence. Husbands noticed but said nothing. Wives ignored it as they went about their work, carrying buckets of water, grinding grain, nursing children. To them, the smell was part of being alive, not a reason for alarm. When infections came, itching, fever, and pain, they were dismissed as bad luck or punishment from God. In monasteries and convents, the silence was worse. Nuns who bled hid their stains under layers of wool, praying harder as though faith could replace hygiene. They could not wash openly, for modesty forbade exposure. The air in their quarters grew damp and close, carrying the iron scent of blood through the stillness of prayer. Sickness spread easily, but it was hidden under obedience. In the name of purity, they suffered in filth. There were no healers who specialized in women's health. Male physicians dismissed menstruation as a mysterious female disorder. Some wrote that it was nature's way of purging evil humours from the body. Others advised marriage as a cure, believing sexual activity would balance the female system. Women, left to their own understanding, passed down fragments of advice: herbs to reduce pain, wool to soften discomfort, but never words to challenge the superstition. Their knowledge lived in whispers, shared only in kitchens and fields, never in books. The absence of cleanliness turned each cycle into a quiet hazard. Infection spread from unwashed cloth, leading to fevers and infertility. Yet death from these causes was rarely linked to menstruation. No one connected the pain of the body with the dirt it carried. Women died young, and their daughters inherited both their silence and their suffering. I find it haunting how centuries of women lived and bled in secrecy, believing their own bodies to be the enemy. The connection between blood and sin shaped more than behaviour, it shaped identity. A bleeding woman was seen as less pure, less holy, less worthy. Even in marriage, her condition excused her from affection but not from labour. She continued to cook, clean, and serve, her strength fading as the days went by. To rest was indulgence. To speak of it was shameful. Over time, the superstition hardened into culture. What began as fear became tradition, passed from one generation to the next without question. The odour of blood and cloth became a rhythm of life, unnoticed but ever present. It stained not just fabric but memory. The air of medieval homes carried that smell, the mark of womanhood buried under silence. Menstruation was both invisible and omnipresent, ignored yet inescapable. Every woman lived with it. Every man benefited from her endurance, and yet no one dared to acknowledge it. The world moved forward under a veil of denial, pretending that the very thing that sustained life did not exist. In that denial, another misunderstanding began to grow, one that blurred the boundaries between human and animal, and soon filled their homes with the stench of both. The medieval home was never silent, nor was it clean. It breathed with the same warmth and smell as the animals that shared it. Cows, sheep, and chickens lived alongside people, not in separate barns but under the same roof. Their presence was practical, even necessary. During winter, the animals' bodies released enough heat to keep the air above freezing. To peasants who owned little more than straw and wood, the warmth of a cow meant survival. The sound of hooves shifting through the night, the soft bleating of sheep, the cluck of hens settling into corners, these were the sounds of comfort. Yet comfort came with a price. It is almost comical that people found peace in sleeping beside the same creatures that filled their homes with filth. The air inside these dwellings was heavy. Smoke from the fire mixed with the damp breath of both humans and animals. The floor was earth, covered with layers of straw that absorbed everything: spilled food, animal droppings, and human waste. The idea of washing or sweeping was absurd. Cleaning meant laying down a new layer of straw to cover the old. Over time, the layers thickened, becoming dark and soft underfoot, a kind of living carpet that squelched when stepped on. The smell that rose from it was beyond description, a blend of ammonia, sweat, and decay that filled every corner. To medieval noses, it was simply home. Cows were often tied near the bed, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at crumbs that fell from the table. Sheep huddled close to the hearth, their wool gathering ash and soot. The warmth they provided came with fleas and lice that crawled easily from animal to human. The same insects that nested in fur found new homes in blankets and hair. Families woke, scratching through the night, but they saw no reason to change their habits. Warmth mattered more than comfort, and familiarity dulled disgust. Children played among the animals, their bare feet pressing into manure. They learned early to step around dung piles without complaint. When they fell, they laughed, and their mothers wiped them off with rags already soiled from other tasks. Disease was invisible, and filth was ordinary. The scent of the home clung to their skin and clothes, following them wherever they went. If compared to today, it would be like sleeping in a barn and calling it a bedroom. Visitors often noticed the stench first, but locals no longer did. Their sense of smell had adapted, numbed by years of exposure. To them, the faint odour of rot was simply the smell of warmth and safety. In a world where cold could kill as quickly as hunger, the stink of manure felt like proof of life. The animals provided more than heat. They were wealth, food, and labour. Losing one to illness or theft was a greater tragedy than any discomfort their presence caused. People would rather breathe in dung than sleep without the sound of a cow nearby. The mingling of species shaped the rhythm of daily life. Mornings began with the same routine: raking hay for the animals, milking cows while standing in mud, and feeding chickens before eating oneself. Meals were cooked while the animals watched, their eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight. The scent of soup and smoke blended with that of manure and wet wool. Even when people ate, the smell of the barn lingered on their fingers. There was no boundary between human space and animal space, between work and rest. The entire house was one shared enclosure, half shelter, half stable. The mixture of waste and moisture attracted pests. Rats thrived in the warm straw, feasting on feed meant for livestock. They crept across sleeping bodies in the dark, bold and unafraid. Their droppings mingled with those of chickens, impossible to tell apart. Flies bred in the corners, buzzing over food and flesh alike. To swat them was useless. They would return as quickly as they left. The medieval home was a small ecosystem, alive with crawling and flying creatures that never left their hosts. Yet even this chaos felt natural to those who lived within it. The smell of decay sank deep into fabric and hair. When people travelled to the market or church, they carried it with them. It clung to their cloaks, their hands, even their breath. The odour of livestock became the scent of humanity itself. To be poor was to smell of animals, and to smell of animals was to survive. No amount of distance could separate a person from the stables that defined their life. I find it unsettling how easily necessity can disguise itself as normalcy. During the coldest months, animals sometimes died indoors. Their bodies froze before anyone had the strength to drag them outside. The carcasses stayed near the walls until spring thawed the ground enough for burial. By then, decomposition had already begun. The stench grew unbearable, but families endured it in silence. They slept beside death because it was easier than facing the cold outside. This strange intimacy between humans and beasts blurred every line that modern people take for granted. Warmth and rot, life and death, were neighbours under the same roof. Wealthier homes fared little better. Stone floors replaced earth, but the animals remained. Horses were kept in lower levels of the house, their smell rising upward through cracks in the floorboards. Servants scrubbed the floors with water scented by herbs, but the effect lasted only a day. The odour of manure returned by morning. In castles, dogs roamed the halls freely, leaving their droppings where they pleased. Cleanliness was a luxury even the nobles could not afford. The practice of spreading new straw over old waste became a tradition. The fresh layer hid the filth, giving the illusion of cleanliness. Once a year, before spring planting, families cleared the floor completely, hauling out months of rotted straw in heavy, steaming piles. The work was back-breaking, the smell unbearable. Yet when it was done, the floor looked new again, until the cycle began once more. This ritual of renewal was the closest thing they had to hygiene. In this world of shared air and unwashed walls, disease found perfect ground. Fleas from livestock carried sickness to humans. Parasites spread through bites, open wounds, and shared bedding. Yet no one blamed the animals. They were family, protectors, and warmth. Their waste was seen as harmless, even useful. Manure was fuel for fires and fertilizer for crops. Its presence inside the home was not filth, but fortune. The very thing that spread illness also fed survival. The medieval household was a place of contradiction. It was both shelter and swamp, sanctuary and breeding ground. The people within it accepted their conditions not because they loved them, but because they knew nothing else. Clean air was not a right but a fantasy. To live was to coexist with smell, to breathe it in and call it life. Homes filled with animals taught people to see filth as comfort. The stink of manure and smoke meant warmth. Silence meant death. The line between human and beast faded beneath the same roof. Yet in that blur of sound and smell, another habit began to form, one that turned from the house to the body itself, where filth was no longer hidden beneath straw but worn proudly as protection against the world outside. Animal fat was the medieval answer to both cold and vanity. People believed that rubbing it onto the skin made them stronger, softer, and more resistant to winter air. Boar fat, goose grease, and tallow from cows or sheep were melted down and stored in jars beside the hearth. The mixture was applied with bare hands, thick and warm, spreading across faces, arms, and legs like a protective coat. To those who lived without soap or clean water, it felt like a luxury. The fat shone faintly in the firelight, giving the skin the illusion of health. It is darkly amusing that what they thought was nourishment for the skin was, in truth, the beginning of its suffocation. Days passed, and the layer of fat thickened. Dust clung to it, forming a dull film that no one tried to remove. The smell grew sour, mingling with sweat and smoke, but the scent became familiar, even comforting. People believed that washing it off too soon would invite illness. Water, after all, was seen as a danger, a thing that opened the body to sickness. So the grease stayed, trapping every particle of dirt the wind carried. Over time, it hardened into a crust, dark and cracked, but still considered protection. The skin beneath it stopped breathing, the pores sealed under layers of filth and oil. In the countryside, the fat served another purpose: insulation. Farmers coated their hands and faces before going to the fields in winter. The greasy sheen repelled wind and cold, or so they believed. Children copied their parents, rubbing animal fat on their cheeks before walking to fetch water. When they returned, the dirt from the path stuck to their skin, turning their faces grey. They laughed at each other's appearance, unaware that the layer would never truly come off. Soap was rare and precious, used only for laundry or the dead. Among women, fat was part of beauty rituals. Some mixed it with herbs or ashes, claiming it brightened the complexion. Others used it to smooth hair or shine their lips. The results were short-lived. Dust gathered quickly, turning the glow into grime. Still, vanity persisted. To appear pale and soft was to look noble, even if the cost was stench and infection. Goose fat was especially prized for its smooth texture, though it spoiled easily. By night, the smell of rancid oil hung around women's chambers, clinging to curtains and blankets. They slept in it, bathed in it, lived inside their own odour. If compared to today, it would be like using spoiled cooking grease as lotion and calling it skincare. Men were no different. Soldiers rubbed tallow on their skin before long marches to keep from chafing under armour. Labourers used it to heal cracks on their hands, though it often caused more pain than relief. In a time without ointments or balms, animal fat was medicine by default. When mixed with soot or herbs, it was believed to cure infections. The irony was bitter. It caused the very ailments it was meant to prevent. Boils, rashes, and cysts appeared, but no one blamed the grease. They blamed demons, curses, or bad luck. The smell followed them everywhere. Entire rooms reeked of old fat, especially in winter when the fires were low and the air unmoving. Blankets, clothes, and hair absorbed it. making every touch slick. The house felt alive with it, a film of grease coating every surface. Visitors noticed first, but their own homes smelled no better. The entire village shared the same odour, and so it became invisible. When everyone stinks, no one stinks. In towns, the practice took on new forms. Artisans who worked with leather or metal coated their hands with lard to protect them from cuts and burns. Housewives used it to polish wooden furniture, leaving a greasy shine that attracted dust. Even priests, who preached purity, rubbed animal fat on their faces in winter to prevent chapping. The contradiction between faith and filth went unnoticed as long as the body felt warm. I cannot help but think that comfort, even when filthy, is often more persuasive than truth. Over time, the build-up on the skin became thick enough to flake. When people scratched themselves, greyish layers peeled away like scales. They mistook it for dry skin, unaware it was a mixture of oil, dirt, and sweat. Beneath it, the pores festered, without air, the skin turned pale, blistered, and cracked. Infection was slow but constant. Still, no one washed. Clean water was scarce, and washing was feared. Some even believed that removing too much dirt angered spirits who protected the body. At night, couples lie beside each other, their bodies sticking together from the grease. The warmth of their skin softened the fat, releasing a faint odour that filled the room. Blankets soaked in it, forming stains that never left. Children, born into that smell, thought it was the scent of love and home. The first thing they touched in life was not clean skin but the oily residue of survival. In noble courts, perfumed oils replaced plain fat, but the difference was cosmetic. The base was still animal. Rosewater or lavender only masked the rot. Servants applied it to their masters' arms and faces, the scent of flowers mixing with decay. It was elegance built on the same filth that ruled the huts of peasants. The wealthy were just better at pretending. The human body in those times was both protected and imprisoned by its own layer of grease. It glistened under firelight, looked alive, but beneath the surface, it suffocated. The pores, sealed and swollen, became symbols of a deeper truth that people had learned to live not against filth, but within it. They mistook endurance for purity and habit for health. What they called preservation was, in fact, slow decomposition carried on the skin. The sheen of animal fat was the mark of both survival and ignorance. It kept the cold away but locked the body in its own waste. To the medieval mind, that trade seemed fair. Warmth mattered more than cleanliness, and smell was a small price to pay for life. Yet beneath that layer of oil and dirt, something worse was forming, a rot not of the body but of the mouth, where neglect took its most visible shape and made even breath itself unbearable. The mouths of medieval people were small graveyards of neglect. Teeth rotted in silence, turning black and crumbling away long before middle age. The idea of cleaning them seemed strange, even unnecessary. People chewed on bits of wood or tree bark when food stuck between their teeth, not to cleanse, but to soothe irritation. Some rubbed ashes or crushed herbs against their gums, believing the sting meant it was working. There were no brushes, no pastes, no thought that decay could be prevented. It is almost tragic how people lived surrounded by pain yet never realized it could have been avoided. The stench of unwashed mouths filled homes and markets alike. It was the smell of meat gone bad, of infection, of slow rot. Conversations carried that odour into the air, mingling with the scent of sweat and smoke. Lovers breathed it into each other's faces. Parents kissed their children with it. The line between affection and contamination disappeared. Breath was not seen as something that could offend. It was simply part of being alive. No one spoke of it because everyone shared it. Food made matters worse. Bread was hard and coarse, often mixed with grit or sand from poorly ground flour. Each bite scraped enamel away like sandpaper. Meat, when available, was salted for weeks, its edges sharp with crystals. Vegetables were rare, and fruit rarer still. Sugar, reserved for the wealthy, corroded teeth even faster. The result was the same across all classes: yellow teeth turning black, bleeding gums, and mouths that oozed infection. Some tried to chew mint or parsley to hide the smell, but it was like throwing flowers on a corpse. The pain was constant. People learned to live with aching jaws and swollen gums that bled when they ate. When a tooth became unbearable, it was yanked out with a knife or a pair of iron tongs. The extraction took seconds, but left behind festering wounds that could kill. Infection spread through the jaw, creeping upward toward the skull. Those who survived were left with sunken mouths and missing teeth, their faces prematurely aged. Yet even this was accepted. A mouthful of gaps was a sign of age and labour, not neglect. If compared to today, it would be like walking through life with an open wound in your face and calling it normal. Children suffered early. Without instructional tools, they followed their parents' example, eating, sleeping, and growing up with decay. The first sign of adulthood for many was losing a tooth, celebrated not as sickness but as inevitability. Mothers would give children small sticks of wood to chew on, believing it strengthened their gums. No one thought to clean them. By adolescence, cavities had already taken hold. Pain was dismissed as bad luck or divine punishment, never as a warning. In towns, the problem multiplied. Markets sold sweets made of honey, molasses, or cheap sugar substitutes like chalk and alum. These sticky treats clung to teeth for hours, feeding decay. Vendors shouted about their freshness while flies circled above. No one realized that every bite carried infection deeper into the mouth. The few physicians who studied dental pain had no answers. They prescribed bleeding or herbal poultices, sometimes even placing hot irons near the face to draw out the rot. Many patients never recovered. Among the wealthy, vanity made matters worse. Perfumed pastes made of crushed pearls, vinegar, and wine were used to polish teeth, but the acids only eroded them faster. Some women painted their lips with lead-based dyes, staining their mouths and poisoning themselves slowly. The pursuit of beauty turned into another form of decay. The rich smiled with rotting teeth and called it refinement. Servants whispered of their mistress's foul breath but dared not speak of it aloud. Rot did not stop at the teeth. The gums became inflamed, the tongue coated in white, and ulcers spread along the cheeks. The entire mouth became a breeding ground for disease. Bad breath was more than unpleasant. It was deadly. Infection often entered the bloodstream through these wounds, leading to fevers that killed without warning. Yet the connection was never made. To most, death came from spirits, not from the stench that lived behind their lips. I find it deeply unsettling that people could carry death inside their own mouths and still call themselves clean. For some, the smell was spiritualized. Priests taught that suffering purified the soul, and physical decay was a test of faith. People with swollen jaws prayed instead of washing. They saw endurance as a virtue and pain as a sign of holiness. This belief turned disease into devotion. When the agony grew unbearable, they called for confession, not for a healer. In a world where God was thought to control all ailments, a rotting mouth was not a medical problem but a moral one. At night, the stench lingered over every bed. Couples turned away from each other to sleep, their breaths filling the small space with a sour warmth. The same odour hung over taverns, churches, and feasts. Wine and herbs could not mask it. The air of the medieval world carried the smell of collective decay, a reminder that everyone was slowly rotting together. Mouths reflected the truth of their age that cleanliness was feared, not desired. To touch water to the lips was to invite sickness, to wash was to risk death. So people chose dirt instead, mistaking survival for health. Their smiles, when they came, were dark and broken, revealing the cost of their ignorance. The mouth was both the tool of speech and the evidence of silence. It told the story of a time when decay was normal and breath itself was a confession of neglect. Teeth fell out one by one, and still people ate, talked, prayed, and kissed without hesitation. The body had adapted to rot. Beneath those blackened smiles, something worse was spreading, not just in the mouth, but in the hands that fed it, where filth built up quietly and began to consume the flesh itself. Hands in the medieval world were tools first, parts of the body second. They tilled soil, fed animals, carried firewood, and prepared food, often without ever being washed. Fingernails grew long and thick, collecting the residue of daily life, soil, sweat, and rot. Dirt became a permanent feature, packed so tightly beneath the nails that even scraping could not remove it. People saw nothing unusual in this. A blackened hand meant hard work, and hard work meant virtue. Clean hands, by contrast, looked suspicious, as if untouched by honest labour. It is grimly ironic that the very signs of diligence were also the marks of disease. There were no scissors or clippers, no grooming rituals beyond what was convenient. When nails grew too long, they were pared down with whatever blade was nearby, a kitchen knife, a sickle, or sometimes the edge of a rusted dagger. The act was careless and quick. Cuts were deep, and blood was common. The iron left small burns on the skin, and rust entered the wounds unseen. Pain was dismissed as clumsiness, not infection. People returned to their chores with hands still bleeding, unaware that the smallest nick might lead to something far worse. Those who could not find a tool simply let their nails grow. The tips curled and cracked, sometimes splitting the skin beneath. Filth gathered in those spaces, turning every gesture into an invitation for infection. Nails darkened, thickened, and in time began to rot. Pus formed at their edges, releasing a smell of decay so strong that it overpowered even the stench of sweat. Yet no one flinched. They continued to eat, to touch, to work. A swollen finger was treated with rags soaked in wine or mud, depending on what was closer. Nothing truly healed. At mealtimes, the sight of dirty nails was ordinary. Hands that had touched soil, animals, or corpses reached into shared bowls. No one thought to clean them. The grit under the nails mixed with food, adding texture that few noticed anymore. A farmer might wipe his hands on his tunic before eating, leaving streaks of earth on the fabric that dried and flaked into the air. The same hands that fed children also carried the bacteria that made them sick. But the connection between dirt and disease was invisible, so the cycle never ended. If compared to today, it would be like using a rusty knife to trim your nails, licking your fingers afterward, and calling it a meal. Infections were slow and cruel. At first, the skin turned red and hot to the touch. Then the nail loosened, throbbing with each heartbeat. Sometimes the swelling spreads to the entire hand, turning it stiff and useless. When the pain became unbearable, people tied rags around the finger and prayed. There were no physicians for such small matters, and no one could afford to stop working. Some fingers turned black at the tip, the flesh dying quietly until it fell away. A missing finger was not pitied. It was seen as the price of labour. The problem worsened in winter. Cold cracked the skin, opening paths for dirt to enter deeper. The grease and soot used to keep the skin soft only sealed the filth inside. Workers rubbed animal fat into their hands for warmth, mixing it with the grime already there. The smell of iron, rot, and tallow followed them everywhere. Inside churches, clasped hands in prayer were dark with stains that would never fade. To touch another was to share not comfort but contagion. Among the wealthy, the hands looked finer but fared no better. Nobles used small knives or sharpened stones for grooming, their blades decorated with silver or bone. The tools were elegant but no cleaner. Infection was as democratic as hunger. It ignored class. Courtly women painted their nails with oils or herbs to hide discoloration, but the rot beneath the polish continued to grow. Their perfumes masked the smell but not the pain. The delicacy of appearance hid the same filth that plagued the poor, only better perfumed. Some believed long nails held mystical power. Fortune-tellers, healers, and some monks let theirs grow as symbols of wisdom or piety. They dipped them in wax or oils to keep them from breaking. Yet the nails themselves were breeding grounds for disease. Beneath their surfaces, microbes thrived. In dark monasteries where cleanliness was replaced by devotion, the sight of long yellow nails folded in prayer became a portrait of both faith and infection. Children imitate what they see. They dug in the dirt, climbed trees, played with animals, and ate with their hands. Their small nails were black before they could even spell their own names. Mothers scolded them for the mess, but never for the danger. When a child's finger swelled, they wrapped it in old cloth and told them to keep working. If the infection spread, it was fate, not filth. The smallest wound could claim a life, but death from such causes was too common to question. I find it haunting how people could lose pieces of themselves to dirt and still believe it was destiny. In markets, the exchange of goods carried the same unseen danger. Coins passed from hand to hand, slick with sweat and grime. Butchers weighed meat with fingers that had trimmed their nails on the same blades used for cutting flesh. Fishmongers scooped their wares with hands soaked in brine and blood. The dirt of the town was shared like currency, traded daily without pause. At night, when the fires dimmed, hands still worked, mending clothes, sewing, feeding livestock. The grime beneath the nails deepened into the skin, staining it permanently. No amount of rubbing could remove it. The smell of rust and earth followed people even in sleep. The hands that prayed, the hands that fed, the hands that killed, all carried the same quiet infection. To the medieval mind, these hands were honest. They told the story of labour, of survival, of touching the world without fear of its filth. Clean hands belonged to those who did not work, and therefore could not be trusted. Dirt was proof of life. But that belief came at a cost. Every blackened nail, every festering cut, every missing finger was the body's quiet protest against ignorance. Hands shaped the world of the Middle Ages. They built, harvested, and bled for it. Yet those same hands were the instruments of decay, carrying sickness from one life to another without ever knowing it. Beneath the crust of grime and callus lay the truth of an age that mistook endurance for purity. And as the hands rotted slowly in silence, something even more horrifying began to appear in the streets, where decay no longer hid behind skin but lay openly for all to see. Death in the medieval world was not hidden behind walls or rituals. It lay in plain sight, sprawled across streets, fields, and doorways. When the disease swept through a village, it came faster than the living could respond. People fell where they stood, and before anyone could carry them away, more followed. The dead began to pile up, men, women, and children, all mixed in the same stillness. There were too many to bury, too few to mourn. The earth itself seemed unwilling to take more. It is horrifying to think that the sight of a body in the street once meant nothing more than another day's reality. The air thickened with decay. The smell of death was not a momentary thing. It lingered, heavy and sour, clinging to skin and clothing. In the heat of summer, bodies swelled, their skin darkening, splitting, releasing gases that filled every breath. Flies covered them in shimmering layers, their droning as constant as prayer. Dogs and rats came soon after, tearing at flesh while people stepped carefully around the remains. The living shared the streets with the dead, and neither seemed to belong more than the other. When the plague struck, entire families died within days. Houses became tombs, doors were nailed shut to contain the stench. but the smell still escaped through cracks in the wood. Neighbours walked past, heads bowed, not in grief, but in resignation. Every home became a silent warning. Those who remained alive avoided touching the bodies, believing disease spread through breath or a divine curse. Yet they had no choice. Someone had to remove the dead. Men with carts came through the alleys, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. They moved like shadows, collecting corpses and stacking them high. By nightfall, the carts were full, but the streets were never empty. Churchyards overflowed. Graves were dug in haste, shallow and narrow, sometimes holding 10 or 20 at once. Dirt was thrown over them carelessly, leaving limbs exposed to the air. Rain softened the soil, and parts of the dead surfaced again. The sight no longer caused panic. It was simply part of life, as ordinary as the cawing of crows that feasted above. The priest prayed for deliverance, but their words vanished beneath the stench. Faith had no power against the weight of decomposition. If compared to today, it would be like stepping over corpses on the way to work and pretending they were just puddles after a storm. Children grew up among these scenes. They played near piles of bodies, chasing each other through grave pits not yet filled. To them, the dead were no different from the sleeping. Their laughter echoed against the stillness, a sound both innocent and cruel. Mothers warned them not to touch, not because of respect, but because of fear. Yet curiosity always won. Small hands brushed against cold skin, and the cycle of disease began anew. In towns, officials tried to impose order. Bells rang to mark the dead, and carts made their rounds at set hours. But no system could keep pace. The dying outnumbered the living, and soon the collectors themselves stopped coming. In some places, people burned the bodies in open fields, hoping the smoke would cleanse the air. The fires roared through the night, painting the sky orange. The scent of burning flesh mixed with the wind, reaching every window and every breath. For weeks, the land smelled of ash and mortality. Not everyone was buried. The poor were left where they fell, their bodies stripped by thieves searching for coins or clothing. Even the devout turned away. Priests who blessed the dead fell ill themselves, their hands blackened by infection. Fear replaced compassion. Death was no longer holy, it was contagious. Families abandoned their own, pushing bodies outside before the last breath was gone. Those who hesitated risked joining them. In the countryside, the process was slower but no less grim. Fields filled with bodies of those who had fled the cities. Some were half buried by relatives too weak to dig. Others were left in barns or beside the roads. The smell of decay travelled on the wind, following the living wherever they went. The world itself became a tomb, vast and indifferent. The line between human and soil blurred as flesh returned to the ground without ceremony. I find it unbearable to imagine a time when love meant leaving someone behind to rot in peace. The horror was not only in the death itself, but in the familiarity of it. The first bodies inspired fear, but the 100th inspired nothing. People grew numb. The sight of a corpse no longer stirred grief or panic. It simply confirmed survival. If one could walk past the dead without joining them, that was enough. The mind adapted to what the body endured. By winter, the corpses froze in place, stiff and silent. Snow covered them like a shroud, erasing their faces but not their presence. Wolves and stray dogs dug through the drifts to reach them, and bones were scattered across the ice. When spring came, the thaw revealed everything again. The dead mingled with the living as if time had not moved at all. The ground itself seemed to breathe sickness. Death in the medieval world was public, physical, and constant. It surrounded every act of life, reminding people that existence was fragile and fleeting. The living walked through streets of decay, carrying the memory of each breath they took through air that once belonged to the dead. In that closeness, fear turned to habit. People stopped seeing the horror around them because to see it was to break. And as they learned to live among corpses, they also learned to eat, trade, and sleep through the smell of slaughter, where life and death met every morning in the open markets. The streets of medieval towns carried the heartbeat of commerce and the stench of slaughter. Markets were crowded with butchers hacking through animal flesh in full view of passers-by. There were no enclosed shops, no separation between the living and the dying. The killing took place on open tables, the knives glinting under pale light. When the meat was cut away, what remained, the guts, the fat, the blood, was pushed aside, spilling into the gutters. Those channels ran thick with waste, winding through the alleys like veins of red mud. It is strangely poetic that a place meant to feed the living also looked like a graveyard for animals. The air was dense with the smell of iron and decay. Blood soaked into the dirt and stayed there for days, turning black beneath the feet of merchants and mothers. Flies gathered in clouds, their buzzing so loud it became part of the sound of the market itself. When the wind shifted, it carried the reek through the entire town, settling into every doorway and fabric. Shopkeepers waved rags to push it away, but the smell was stronger than any effort. People grew used to it the way they grew used to hunger or pain. It was simply part of living. In the mornings, butchers led animals through the same streets where children played. The animals left trails of dung and urine that mixed with the runoff from the slaughter tables. Hooves slipped on the slick cobblestones as knives struck bone nearby. The noise was unending, a wet rhythm of cleavers and squeals echoing between stone walls. When a carcass was stripped, the intestines were tossed into the drainage channels, where they joined old waste and stagnant water. By noon, the street glistened with filth, yet buyers arrived all the same, stepping carefully but without disgust. Women carried baskets past pools of blood, their skirts brushing against wet stone. Some even paused to chat as they bargained over prices, their words punctuated by the sound of chopping meat. Children followed behind, fascinated by the sight of steaming organs piled high. Stray dogs fought over discarded livers and lungs, tearing them apart while people watched without concern. It was a daily theatre of survival, played out so often that no one questioned its horror. If compared to today, it would be like shopping for vegetables in the middle of an operating room floor. The smell was strongest in the heat. Under the sun, fat melted and ran into the streets, congealing again by evening into thick layers that cracked underfoot. Rats appeared in droves, feeding on what the dogs left behind. The townsfolk swatted flies from their faces as they ate their meals beside the same drains where blood still flowed. When it rained, everything mixed, the filth, the organs, the mud, forming rivers that carried the waste through the lower parts of town. The people there, often the poorest, lived with that flow at their doors. No one thought of sanitation. The idea that disease could come from filth was centuries away. Instead, people saw blood as a sign of freshness, a symbol that food was abundant. The redder the market, the better the business. But that blood did not stay where it fell. It crept into the wells, the soil, and even the air. Fevers spread through the population, carried not by spirits or curses, but by the invisible residue of slaughter. Yet no one blamed the markets. Illness was seen as fate, not a consequence. Inside the butcher stalls, men worked bare-handed, their fingers stained crimson from dawn to dusk. They wiped their hands on their aprons or trousers, then touched the meat again. Cuts and wounds on their skin festered with infection, yet they continued. The more blood they carried home, the more it marked them as skilled. A clean butcher was seen as lazy. Customers respected the stains. There was pride in filth, in the proof that one worked close to death to keep others alive. In smaller villages, slaughter was a communal act. Neighbours gathered to watch and help, laughing as they pulled organs free or drained the carcass into a ditch. Children carried buckets of blood to the gardens, believing it made the soil fertile. No one saw the danger in it. The same hands that handled entrails later kneaded dough and fed families. The smell followed them everywhere, soaked into their clothes and hair, until even sleep carried the scent of the market. The city authorities tried, at times, to control it. They issued decrees demanding butchers work outside the main square, near the river. But those rivers were already choked with waste. When rain came, the banks overflowed, and the same filth washed back into town. The water that people drank was the same water that had washed the blood from the streets. The cycle was perfect, complete, and deadly. I can't help but think how easily the medieval world accepted its own contamination as ordinary life. By nightfall, the market quieted, but the smell remained. Dogs prowled among the stalls, gnawing on scraps left behind. The gutters glistened under the dim light of torches, their contents still slowly moving toward the outskirts of town. In the silence, one could almost hear the slow gurgle of decay. The people slept with that sound outside their windows, unbothered, their dreams carrying the same dull acceptance of filth that ruled their waking hours. Morning always came the same way, with new animals, new knives, and new blood. The previous day's waste had not yet dried, but there was no pause. The rhythm of slaughter began again, endless and indifferent. The smell of the market was the smell of the entire town, and no one could tell where one ended and the other began. In that world, filth was not the exception, but the essence of survival, a truth soaked into the stones themselves. Filth had become the rhythm of daily life, accepted as naturally as breath itself. The people who stepped over the streams of blood and rot no longer noticed what clung to their boots. In that numb acceptance, something unseen was growing within them, something carried not by sight or smell, but by their very flesh, as the stench of death became the scent of ordinary life. In medieval towns, the air was thick with human scent, sweat, oil, smoke, and dirt blended into a constant heaviness that lingered over every street. There was no perfume to disguise it, no soap strong enough to erase it, and no habit of washing to keep it away. People lived within their own smell as naturally as they lived within their skin. The idea of masking it was foreign, even suspicious. A clean scent did not signal purity, but deceit. Those who smelled of flowers or herbs were viewed with mistrust, as if they were trying to hide something unnatural. It was a world where the stench of life was not an embarrassment, but a badge of existence. Men and women alike carried their odours openly. Sweat soaked through layers of linen and wool until the fabric stiffened. In the heat of summer, entire households reeked of bodies left unwashed for months. The smell clung to furniture, bedding, and hair. It was said that one could recognise a person's home long before reaching it, simply by the air that surrounded its doorway. Even churches, those supposed sanctuaries of purity, were filled with the scent of humanity. When crowds knelt to pray, the mixture of breath and sweat rose like a separate offering. Perfume was not part of ordinary life. Only the rich could afford scented oils, and even they used them sparingly. Common people had neither the means nor the reason to seek fragrance. Soap, made from animal fat and ashes, carried its own foul odour. To smell of nothing at all was impossible. Every movement, every task, added another layer to the body's aroma. The smell of earth clung to farmers, smoke to blacksmiths, and fish to market vendors. Together, these created a shared atmosphere that everyone accepted. If compared to today, it would be like stepping into an office building where every person had not showered for years and believed deodorant was a lie. The modern idea of freshness simply did not exist. To medieval people, the body's natural odour was part of being alive, a sign that one worked and belonged. Those who smelled too clean were thought vain or weak. There was even a moral tone to it. The scent of sweat was honest labour, while perfume hinted at sin or temptation. Women were not spared from this perception. They too wore the weight of sweat beneath their gowns, mixing it with dust, menstrual blood, and smoke from the hearth. Hair is washed only a few times a year, trapping every scent the body releases. There were no scented powders or lotions to cover it. A woman might dab herself with a handful of crushed herbs, but their scent faded within hours. The body was not something to cleanse, it was something to endure. Public gatherings became tests of endurance, feasts, markets, and church services were filled with overlapping odours, animal hides, unwashed feet, sour breath, and damp wool. The air itself seemed to ferment. People grew accustomed to breathing it, their noses dulled by exposure. Complaints were rare, not because the smell was mild, but because it was universal. Everyone stank, and so no one could stand apart. To comment on it would be to insult oneself. In homes, the scent of sweat mixed with the lingering smoke of fires used for cooking and warmth. Clothes never fully dried, trapping moisture and bacteria. On cold days, windows stayed shut, turning each room into a slow-cooking stew of odour. Guests entering from outside sometimes gagged, but hosts noticed nothing. Their senses had long adapted, even in castles, where wealth allowed cleaner linen and slightly better air. The smell of unwashed bodies never vanished. It is unsettling to think of how normalised this became. The smell of decay was not considered a warning sign, but simply another note in the familiar atmosphere. There was no sense of contamination, no concept that odour meant danger. The link between cleanliness and health had not yet been imagined. People saw illness as divine punishment, not as something carried by dirt or smell. A man could be dying of infection and still take pride in the sweat on his skin. Children grew up surrounded by this acceptance. Their first lessons were not about bathing or brushing, but about work and obedience. Mothers wiped their faces with the edge of their aprons and sent them back to play. When those children became adults, they passed down the same habits. Cleanliness was not inherited as a virtue but dismissed as a vanity. The word fresh belonged to food, not to people. It is strange how a society that built cathedrals and wrote poetry could live so comfortably within its own stench. There were a few exceptions. Monks and nuns, bound by discipline, occasionally used scented water to wash before prayer, believing it purified the soul, but even they avoided frequent bathing, fearing it would weaken the body. Among ordinary people, smell defined identity. A man's odour told others his trade, his class, and his place in the world. It was the scent of survival itself. By evening, when labourers returned home, their sweat had dried into crusted salt on their skin. They lay down in the same clothes they had worn all day, surrounded by others just as unwashed. The air grew heavier as bodies pressed together for warmth. It was said that one could hear the sound of sleep and smell it at once, the breath of hundreds merging into one single exhalation of life, dense and sour. The smell of humanity was everywhere, woven into the streets, soaked into the walls, and thick in the air that filled every lung. To them, it was not filth, but familiarity, the mark of existence itself. Clean air would have seemed alien, even frightening, like the absence of proof that one was still alive. Life in the medieval world was a constant negotiation with dirt and odour, a quiet endurance of what the body produced and the earth absorbed. Yet that endurance came with a cost, one the people could not smell but would soon suffer. The scent that once defined labour and belonging was also the scent of slow decay. As they walked among their own fumes, unseen things began to breed on their skin and in their lungs. What they thought was harmless sweat carried the first signs of invisible sickness, one that would soon remind them that nature's scent could turn against them without warning. A newborn in the medieval world entered life not into cleanliness but into filth. Birth took place on straw floors, sometimes in animal stalls or dark corners of a house that already smelled of sweat and smoke. After delivery, no one thought to wash the child. The first act of care was to wrap it tightly in strips of old cloth, some already damp with age, others reused from previous births. The child's skin, still covered with blood and fluids, was left untouched. It was believed that washing a baby so soon after birth would make it sick, that water opened the body to spirits waiting to slip inside. As the cloth absorbed moisture and waste, it became the child's second skin. The fabric darkened day by day, stiffening with dried urine and excrement. Mothers rarely changed it, fearing the cold more than the dirt. Babies lie still, swaddled tightly to keep them warm, unable to move or cry freely. Beneath the layers, rashes bloomed and tiny wounds festered unseen. The smell was sharp and sour, but to the family it was simply the smell of infancy. No one questioned it. Clean water was scarce, and most families would not waste it on a baby. When washing did happen, it was done with cold water from a shared bucket that might have also been used to clean dishes or soak laundry. There was no soap, no towel, only a quick splash and a wipe with the same cloth that had already served many purposes. The umbilical cord, tied crudely with a strip of rag, was often left uncovered. It dried slowly, collecting dust and bacteria from the air. When infection came, it was seen as a sign from God, not as the result of neglect. Mothers and midwives followed old customs. They rubbed the baby's skin with oil or animal fat to keep it from cracking in the cold. Over time, the mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt formed a coating that sealed every pore. It looked like care, but it was suffocation. It is strange how protection and harm can look the same when knowledge is missing. Babies smelled of sour milk and rancid fat, their skin sticky to the touch. Yet to their parents, this was the smell of health. A clean baby was thought weak, a dirty one strong enough to survive. In homes crowded with people and animals, newborns were laid close to the hearth or under their mothers' beds. Chickens pecked near their feet, dogs sniffed their faces, and flies gathered around the damp fabric that wrapped them. Infants shared the same air as adults who rarely bathed, breathing smoke, dust, and disease. When a baby fell ill, the reason seemed invisible. A fever might be blamed on bad air or a curse rather than the rotting cloth pressed against its skin. Even when signs of infection appeared, swollen cords, oozing sores, cries that would not stop, families did little. There were no healers to call, no remedies to trust. The dead were buried quietly, sometimes within days of birth, their bodies small enough to fit in baskets or boxes. In some villages, it was said that babies who died young returned as angels, sparing the parents from shame. It is haunting to imagine how many losses were accepted as ordinary, how many preventable deaths were mistaken for fate. For the poor, survival itself was the only goal. The care of infants reflected the same harsh economy as their own lives. What could not be spared for adults would not be spent on children. Even the wealthy were not immune to ignorance. In noble homes, swaddling was tighter, fabrics finer, but the practices were the same. Servants reused bandages and cloths without washing, and scented oils merely hid decay beneath a pleasant layer of fragrance. The concept of hygiene as protection had not yet been born. Cleanliness was a luxury of time and knowledge, neither of which the common people possessed. A baby's survival depended more on chance than on care. When one lived past infancy, it was seen as divine favour. When one died, it was simply life continuing its grim rhythm. Mothers wept, fathers dug, and the house carried on. The smell of a newborn's bedding mixed with the rest of the home, animals, food, and unwashed bodies, until it became indistinguishable. No one could tell where the baby's odour ended and the family's began. It was all one smell, the scent of life in a world without soap or understanding. Those who lived long enough to remember their beginnings carried that scent in their memory, though few would have recognised it as filth. The tragedy lies not in the ignorance alone, but in the belief that such practices were care. Parents loved their children, yet their love was wrapped in dirt and sealed by custom. To them, it was safety. To us, it is horror. Still, their intent was not cruelty. It was survival under rules they never chose. Life continued in those houses. More babies were born, wrapped, and left unwashed. Each one carried the same risk, the same quiet fate waiting in the folds of the cloth. They breathed the same foul air, slept on the same straw, and were watched over by the same weary eyes that had learned to expect loss. The cycle repeated until death became a neighbour so familiar it no longer frightened anyone. A newborn's first days in the medieval world were not filled with innocence but with infection. The warmth that kept it alive also bred decay, and the hands that held it tenderly did not know they were holding danger. Cleanliness would one day be linked to survival, but in that time, dirt was the cradle of life itself. The silence that followed each small death did not bring questions. It brought acceptance, and in that acceptance, generations passed without learning the cost of what they called care. Somewhere between ignorance and endurance, they mistook rot for resilience, believing the smell of sickness was only the smell of life continuing. Skin disease was so common in the medieval world that it barely counted as illness. Every family carried its share of sores, rashes, and scabs. Men scratched as they worked, women rubbed at their arms or thighs, and children's nails were always caked with dried skin and pus. No one found it strange. The body itched, bled a little, then healed badly, and life went on. To live without sores was more suspicious than to have them. The causes were everywhere. Dirty water, unwashed clothes, shared bedding, and constant contact with animals turned the skin into a battlefield. Lice and mites crawled under the surface, leaving red tunnels of irritation. Fungal patches spread between toes, turning skin white and cracked. Under layers of coarse fabric, sweat mixed with dust and oil, feeding the infections day after day. Some itched until they bled. Others hardened into yellow crusts. People believed this was simply how the body worked. An itchy rash might be seen as a sign of bad blood or divine cleansing. The pain was part of living, as inevitable as hunger. If compared to today, it would be like everyone walking around with untreated eczema and open sores, yet thinking it was just the weather. There were no creams, no baths, and no concept of hygiene as prevention. The closest thing to treatment was scratching until the skin tore or wiping with a damp rag used for many other purposes. The poor suffered most, but even the wealthy were not immune. Fine clothes could not protect them from invisible parasites. Servants washed their garments in filthy rivers, and the residue of soap made from fat did little more than spread the irritation. Perfume masked the smell of rot, but not the source. In castles and huts alike, people slept on straw crawling with insects. The itching became background noise, a constant reminder of being alive. When one patch healed, another appeared. The worst infections grew around joints or in hidden folds of skin. Those who worked long hours in the heat developed sores on their backs and legs. Farmers' hands split open, and the cracks filled with dirt. Many believed the pus leaking from wounds was the body's way of purging bad humours, and so they let it flow. Doctors, when called, prescribed bloodletting or herbs, neither of which helped. Mothers rubbed lard or butter onto their children's rashes, hoping to soothe them, but the grease only trapped more dirt. The result was a thick layer of filth that softened into a grey paste. Babies scratched their faces against the fabric of their swaddles until their cheeks bled. Still, the family saw no reason for alarm. Everyone around them bore the same marks. To have clear skin was a luxury too strange to trust. Inside homes, flakes of skin and scabs fell like dust. The floor mixed them with ashes and crumbs from meals. Flies gathered around the damp spots where pus had seeped through the fabric. The smell of infection was faint but ever present, blending into the sour odour of sweat and smoke. No one swept carefully, for dirt was already everywhere. It is unsettling to realize that comfort was measured by endurance, not cleanliness. The more one could tolerate the itch, the more respectable they appeared. Complaining too much meant weakness, and weakness meant danger in a world that rewarded survival above all else. People accepted pain as part of their daily rhythm, like hunger or cold. The clergy offered little relief. They warned that excessive care of the body was vanity. Washing too often could tempt sin. Suffering, they said, purified the soul. So the people endured, praying for heaven while scratching their wounds on earth. Disease became a private ritual, one that united rich and poor alike in silent misery. Markets sold no ointments, only cloths and oils meant for other uses. Sometimes apothecaries ground herbs into powder, claiming they cured any skin ailment. Most of these were scams, chalk, ash, or dried dung mixed with wine. People smeared them over their sores, waiting for miracles that never came. When they did heal, it was by chance. And chance was called faith. Even when infection spread beyond control, when limbs swelled or flesh turned black, there was little that could be done. Amputation or death followed, both accepted as fate. Those who survived carried scars for life, patterns of suffering written on their skin like a map of endurance. Children grew up seeing those scars and did not fear them. They expected their own skin to someday bear the same marks. There was no shame in the sight of wounds, only familiarity. Lovers touched each other's scars without hesitation. Families shared the same blankets and brushes. The idea that disease could pass from one person to another was unknown. Skin was simply what it was, itching, cracking, bleeding, healing again, always repeating. To live with sores was to belong. The body mirrored the world rough, imperfect, enduring. Dirt was not an intruder but a companion, one that shaped their daily habits and even their sense of identity. The skin was not a boundary to protect life, but a canvas where hardship wrote itself again and again. The itch became so constant that silence felt strange without it. Scratching filled the pauses between work and rest, a small relief in an endless struggle with discomfort. People found calm in routine pain, believing it to be normal, perhaps even necessary. Life carried on beneath layers of grime, where skin met cloth and cloth met filth. The body, wrapped in its own neglect, survived despite everything. They did not know they were sick because everyone was the same. Health, in that world, was not the absence of disease, but the ability to keep living through it. The people of that age did not fight their afflictions, they befriended them. In their minds, the sores were not enemies but reminders that life was still inside them, restless, imperfect, and raw. Yet beneath that belief, something was waiting, something that would soon prove that these small sufferings were only the beginning of greater decay. Smell defined more than comfort in the medieval world. It defined class. The poor carried their odour like an unavoidable mark, one that followed them through the streets and into the fields. Sweat, dirt, and the staleness of unwashed clothes became part of their identity. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how honest their lives were, the stench that clung to them spoke louder than their words. It was a society where the nose judged faster than the mind. Among the upper classes, the difference was not cleanliness but disguise. Nobles hid their natural odours beneath layers of perfume, powders, and scented oils, while the poor had only air and time. The rich might have smelled of roses and amber, but underneath, their bodies were no cleaner than those of the peasants who served them. The illusion of fragrance became another form of hierarchy, a way to prove superiority through scent, even when it was false. The poor were told their smell was a reflection of sin or laziness, though their work made the entire world run. Farmers, butchers, tanners, and washerwomen bore the strongest scents, and society used this as proof of their lower worth. The smell of labour was not respected but feared, as if it could contaminate those of higher standing. If compared to today, it would be like judging someone's morality by the brand of soap they use. In that world, scent replaced reputation. Within small villages, people knew each other by smell before sight. The odour of each household was distinct smoke, animals, sweat, or sour wine, and it marked their place in the social order. Marriages between classes were discouraged not only by wealth but by scent. A noble might tolerate a peasant's accent, but not their smell. It was said that even the air around the poor was tainted, and this belief excused cruelty as a natural order. Priests sometimes preached that odour was the scent of sin leaving the body, that the stench of the poor proved their humility before God. The wealthy, perfumed and powdered, were told their fragrance symbolized grace. Both ideas served the same purpose, to justify why nothing should change. Smell became theology. The poor accepted their scent as fate, believing it was what they were born to carry. Bathing, when mentioned, was seen as an unnecessary luxury. Only those with time to waste and servants to heat water could afford it. For everyone else, the body remained a landscape of dust and labour. Hands that tilled the earth in the morning touched bread at noon and wiped sweat at night. The same odour followed them to sleep, seeping into their straw mattresses and coarse blankets. There was no escape from it, only endurance. The marketplace became the great mingling of scents, the wealthy passing by in perfumed cloaks, the poor selling vegetables and meat that had long since begun to spoil. The contrast was overwhelming. The clean smell of herbs could not erase the rot beneath. Yet the people did not recoil. They were used to the blend. It was life in its rawest form, unfiltered and accepted. Children grew up inhaling this hierarchy. They learned early that poverty had a smell, that filth clung to those who worked the hardest. By adulthood, they carried it with pride or shame, depending on their place in the chain. Even death could not erase it. The poor were buried in the same clothes they had worn for years, their final scent a mix of labour and dust. It is strange to think how a society that feared sin more than dirt found holiness in perfume. Cleanliness was not about hygiene, but about power. The scent of the rich was seen as divine favour, while the stench of the poor was condemned as proof of corruption. Yet in truth, both were prisoners of the same ignorance. No one understood that the air they shared carried the same sickness. Over time, the belief that scent revealed virtue hardened into habit. Those who smelled bad were not just unclean, they were unworthy. The body became a label, an unavoidable confession of one's place in the world. People did not wash to be healthy. They hid to appear righteous. The smell of humanity itself had been sorted into ranks, dividing not by soul but by skin. The streets of medieval towns were a reflection of this invisible order. The perfumed passed the unwashed, both avoiding the other's gaze. The wind that carried the stench of decay also carried the lies that justified it. Beneath the hierarchy of scent, all people were bound by the same air, breathing the same invisible filth, dying from the same ignorance. Over centuries, that belief would begin to crumble, slowly replaced by knowledge and fear of disease. But for those who lived through it, smell remained the truest social barrier, one that could not be crossed by wealth alone. In the end, the air of the medieval world was not divided by purity but by perception. The scent of labour, the perfume of wealth, the rot of neglect, all mingled under the same sky, each pretending it did not belong to the other. The smell of class was the smell of the age itself, human, flawed, and unwashed. The people who lived in it no longer noticed. To them, it was simply the way things were, the scent of survival in a world that had forgotten the meaning of clean. And as their world faded into history, that scent lingered in memory, a ghostly reminder that beneath the robes and rags, they all shared the same breath. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine that ancient air fading slowly away, carrying with it the noise, the dirt, and the scent of forgotten lives. May your rest be quiet, your thoughts clean, and your dreams untouched by the past. Good night.